Chapter 18 of Lady Baltimore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lois Hill. Lady Baltimore by Owen WISTER. Chapter 18. Again the Replacers. But a little while, and all that I had just witnessed in such vivid dumb show might have seemed to me in truth some masque, so smooth had it been and voiceless, coming and going like a devised fancy. And after the last of the players was gone from the stage, leaving the white cloth and the silver and the cups and the groups of chairs near the pleasant arbor, I watched the deserted garden whence the sunlight was slowly departing, and it seemed to me more than ever like some empty and charming scene in a playhouse, to which the comedians would in due time return to repeat their delicate pantomime. But these were mental indulgences with which I sat playing until the sight of my interrupted letter to Aunt Carola on the table before me brought the reality of everything back into my thoughts, and I shook my head over Miss Eliza. I remembered that hand of hers lying in despondent acquiescence upon her lap, as the old lady sat in her best dress, formally and faithfully accepting the woman whom her nephew John had brought upon them as his bride-elect, formally and faithfully accepting this distasteful person, and thus atoning as best she could to her beloved nephew for the wrong that her affection had led her to do him in that ill-starred and inexcusable tampering with his affairs. But there was my letter waiting. I took my pen and finished what I had to say about the Negro and the injustice we had done to him, as well as to our own race, by the 15th Amendment. I wrote, I think Northerners must often seem to these people strangely obtuse in their attitude. And they deserve such opinion, since all they need to do is come here and see for themselves what the war did to the South. You may have a perfectly just fight with a man and beat him rightly, but if you are able to go on with your work next day, while his health is so damaged that for a long while he limps about as a cripple, you must not look up from your busy thriving and reproach him with his helplessness, and remind him of its cause, nor must you be surprised that he remembers the fight longer than you have time for. I know that the North meant to be magnanimous, that the North was magnanimous, that the spirit of Grant at Appomattox filled many breasts, and I know that the magnanimity was not met by those who led the South after Lee's retirement, and before Reconstruction set in, and that the 15th Amendment was brought on by their own doings. When have two wrongs made a right? And to place the Negro above these people was an atrocity. You could not expect them to inquire very industriously how magnanimous this North meant to be when they have suffered at her hands worse, far worse, than France suffered from Germany's after 1870. I do think there should be a different spirit among some of the later born, but I have come to understand even the slights and suspicions from which I here and there suffer, since to their minds, shut in by circumstance, I'm always a Yankee. We are prosperous, and prosperity does not bind, it merely assembles people, at dinners and dances. It is adversity that binds, beside the gravestone, beneath the desolated roof. Could you come here and see what I have seen, the retrospect of suffering, the long, lingering convalescence, the small outlook of vigor to come, and the steadfast sodality of affliction and affection and fortitude, your kind but unenlightened heart would be wrung as mine has been, and is being, at every turn. After I had posted this reply to Aunt Carola, I had some fears that my pen had run away with me, and that she might now descend upon me with that reproof which she knew so well how to exercise in cases of disrespect. But there was actually a certain pathos in her mildness when it came. She felt it her duty to go over a good deal of history first, but I do not understand the present generation, she finished, and I suppose that I was not meant to. The little sigh in these words did great credit to Aunt Carola. This vindication off my mind, and relieved by it of the more general thoughts about Kings Port and the South, which the pantomime of Kings Port's forced capitulation to Hortense had raised in me, I returned to the personal matters between that young woman and John, and Charley. How much did Charley know? How much would Charley stand? How much would John stand, if he came to know? Well, the scene in the garden now helped me to answer these questions much better than I could have answered them before its occurrence. With one fact, the great fact of love, established, it was not difficult to account for at least one or two of the several things that puzzled me. There could be no doubt that Hortense loved John Mayrant, loved him beyond her own control. When this love had begun made no matter. Perhaps it began on the bridge, when the money was torn, and Eliza La Heu had appeared. The Kings Port version of Hortense's indifference to John before the event of the phosphates might well enough be true. It might even well enough be true that she had taken him and his phosphates at Newport for lack of anything better at hand, and because she was sick of disappointed hopes. In this case, Charley's subsequent appearance as something very much better, if the phosphates were to fail, would perfectly explain the various postponements of the wedding. So I was able to answer my questions to myself thus: how much did Charley know? Just what he could see for himself, and what he had most likely heard from Newport gossip. He could have heard of an old engagement made purely for money's sake, and of recent delays created by the lady, and he could see the gentleman an impossible husband from a Wall Street standpoint, to whom Hortense was evidently tempering her final refusal by taking an interest in helping along his phosphate fortune. Charley would not refuse to lend her his aid in this estimable benevolence, nor would it occur to Charley's sensibilities how such benevolence would be taken by John if John were not taken himself. Yes, Charley was plainly fooled, and fooled the more readily because he had the old version of the truth. How should he suspect there was a revised version? How should he discover that passion had now changed sides, that it was now John who allowed himself to be loved? The signs of this did not occur before his eyes. Of course, Charley would not stay fooled forever, the hours of that were numbered, but their number was quite beyond my guessing. How much would Charley stand? He would stand a good deal, because the measure of his toleration was the measure of his desire for Hortense, and it was plain that he wanted her very much indeed. But how much would John stand? How soon would his fire-eating traditions produce a difficulty? Why had they not done this already? Well, the garden had in some way helped me to frame a fairly reasonable answer for this also. Poor Hortense had become as powerless to woo John to warmth as poor Venus had been with Adonis, and passion, in changing sides, had advanced the boy's knowledge. He knew now the difference between the embraces of his lady when she had merely wanted his phosphates, and these other caresses now that she wanted him. In his ceaseless search for some possible loophole of escape, his eye could not have overlooked the chance that lay in Charley, and he was far too canny to blast his forlorn hope. He had probably wondered what had changed the nature of Hortense's caresses, and the adventure of the torn money could scarce have failed to suggest itself to the mind of a youth who, little as he had trodden the ways of the world, evidently possessed some lively instincts regarding the nature of women. To batter Charley, as he had battered Juno's nephew, might result in winding the arms of Hortense around his own neck more tightly than ever. Why Hortense could keep Charley on any longer was what I could least fathom, but I trusted her to have excellent reasons for anything that she did. It's sure to be quite simple once you know it, I told myself, and the near future proved me to be right. Thus I laid most of my enigmas to rest. There was but one which now and then awakened still. Were Hortense a raw girl of 18, I could easily grant that the fire eater in John would be sure to move her. But Hortense had traveled many miles away from the green forests of romance. Her present fields were carpeted, not with grass and flowers, but with oriental mats and rugs, and it was electric lights, not the moon and stars, that shone upon her highly seasoned nights. No, torn money and all, it was not appropriate in a woman of her experience. And so I still found myself inquiring in the words of Beverly Rodgers, "But what can she want him for?" The next time that I met Mrs. Gregory St. Michael, it was on my way to join the party at the old church, which Mrs. Weguelin was going to show them. The card case was in her hand, and the sight of it prompted me to allude to Hortense Rieppe. "I find her beauty growing upon me," I declared. Mrs. Gregory did not deny the beauty, although she spoke with reserve at first. "It is to be said that she knows how to write a suitable note," the lady also admitted. She didn't tell me what the note was about, naturally, but I could imagine with what joy, in the exercise of her art, Hortense had constructed that communication which must have accompanied the prompt return of the card case. Then Mrs. Gregory's tongue became downright. "Since you're able to see so much of her, why don't you tell her to marry that little steam yacht gambler? I'm sure he's dying to, and he's just the thing for her." "Ah," I returned, "love so seldom knows what's just the thing for marriage." "Then your precocity theory falls," declared Mrs. St. Michael. And as she went away from me along the street, I watched her beautiful, stately walk, for who could help watching a sight so good? Charley, then, was no secret to John's people. Was John still a secret to Charley? Could Hortense possibly have managed this? I hoped for a chance to observe the two men with her during the visit of Mrs. Weguelin St. Michael and her party to the church. This party was already assembled when I arrived upon the spot appointed. In the street, a few paces from the church, stood Bohm and Charley and Kitty and Gazza, with Beverly Rodgers, who, as I came near, left them and joined me. "Oh, she's somewhere off with her fire eater," responded Beverly to my immediate inquiry for Hortense. "Do you think she was asked, old man?" Probably not, I thought. "But she goes so well with the rest," I suggested. Beverly gave his chuckle. "She goes where she likes. She'll meet us here when we're finished, I'm pretty sure." "Why such certainty?" "Well, she has to attend to Charley, you know." Mrs. Weguelin, it appeared, had met the party here by the church, but had now gone somewhere in the immediate neighborhood to find out why the gate was not opened to admit us, and to hasten the unpunctual custodian of the keys. I had not looked for precisely such a party as Mrs. Weguelin's invitation had gathered, nor could I imagine that she had fully understood herself what she was gathering. And this I intimated to Beverly Rodgers, saying, "Do you suppose, my friend, that she suspected the feather of the birds you flock with?" Beverly took it lightly. "Hang it, old boy, of course everybody can't be as nice as I am." But he took it less lightly before it was over. We stood chatting apart, he and I, while Bohm and Charley and Kitty and Gazza walked across the street to the window of a shop, where old furniture was for sale at a high price, and it grew clearer to me what Beverly had innocently brought upon Mrs. Weguelin, and how he had brought it. The little quiet, particular lady had been pleased with his visit, and pleased with him. His good manners, his good appearance, his good English trained voice, all these things must have been extremely to her taste. And then, more important than they, did she not know about his people? She had inquired, he told me, with interest about two of his uncles, whom she had last seen in 1858. "She's awfully the right sort," said Beverly. Yes, I saw well how that visit must have gone. The gentle old lady reviving in Beverly's presence, and for the sake of being civil to him, some memories of her girlhood, some meetings with those uncles, some dances with them, and generally shedding from her talk and manner the charm of some sweet old melody. And Beverly, the facile, the appreciative, sitting there with her at a correct, deferential angle on his chair, admirably sympathetic and in good form, and playing the old school. He had no thought to deceive her. The old school was his by right, and genuinely in his blood. He took to it like a duck to the water. How should Mrs. Weguelin divine that he also took to the nouveau jeu to the tune of Bohm and Charley and Kitty and Gazza, and so to show him some attention? And because she couldn't ask him to a meal, why, she would take him over the old church, her colonial forefathers. She would tell him the little legends about them. He was precisely the young man to appreciate such things, and she would be pleased if he would also bring the friends with whom he was traveling. I looked across the street at Bohm and Charley and Kitty and Gazza. They were now staring about them in all their perfection of stare. Small Charley in a sleek, slate-colored suit, as neat as any little barber. Bohm, massive, portentous, his strong shoes and gloves the chief note in his dress, and about his whole firm frame a heavy, mechanical strength, a look as of something that did something rapidly and accurately when set going, cut or cracked or ground or smashed something better and faster than it had ever been cut or cracked or ground or smashed before, and would take your arms and legs off if you didn't stand well back from it. It was only in Bohm's eye and lips that you saw he wasn't made entirely of brass and iron, that champagne and shoulders décolletés received a punctual share of his valuable time. And there was Kitty, too, just the wife for Bohm, so soon as she could divorce her husband, to whom she had united herself before discovering that all she married him for, his old Knickerbocker name, was no longer in the slightest degree necessary for social acceptance. While she could feed people, her trough would be well thronged. Kitty was neat. Kitty was trig. Kitty was what Beverly would call swagger. Her skillful, tailor-made clothes sheathed her closely and gave her the excellent appearance of a well-folded English umbrella. It was in her hat that she had gone wrong. A beautiful hat in itself, one which would have wholly become Hortense, but for poor Kitty it didn't do at all. Yes, she was a well-folded English umbrella, only the umbrella had for its handle the head of a bulldog or the leg of a ballet dancer, and these were the replacers whom Beverly's clear-sighted eyes saw swarming round the temple of his civilization, pushing down the aisles, climbing over the backs of the benches, walking over each other's bodies, and seizing those front seats which his family had sat in since New York had been New York. And so the wise fellow very prudently took every step that would ensure the replacers inviting him to occupy one of his own chairs. I had almost forgotten little Gazza, the Italian nobleman who sold old furniture to new Americans. Gazza was not looking at the old furniture of Kings Port, which must have filled his Vatican soul with contempt. He was strolling back and forth in the street, with his head in the air, humming, now loudly, now softly, La 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 la, e quando alla predica in chiesa sedieria, la 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 la. And I thought to myself that, were I the Pope, I should kick him into the Tiber. When Mrs. Weguelin St. Michael came back with the keys and their custodian, Bohm was listening to the slow, clear words of Charley, in which he evidently found something that at length interested him a little. Bohm, it seemed, did not often speak himself, possibly once a week. His way was to let other people speak to him when there were signs in his face that he was hearing anything which they said. It was a high compliment to them, and of course Charley could command Bohm's ear. For Charley, although he was as neat as any barber, and let Hortense walk on him because he looked beyond that and purposed to get her, was just as potent in the financial world as Bohm, could bring a borrowing empire to his own terms just as skillfully as could Bohm, was, in short, a man after Bohm's own. I had almost said heart. The expression is so obstinately embedded in our language. Bohm listening and Charley talking, had neither of them noticed Mrs. Weguelin's arrival. They stood ignoring her while she waited, casting a timid eye upon them, but Beverly, suddenly perceiving this and begging her pardon for them, brought the party together, and we moved in among the old graves. "Ah," said Gazza, bending to read the quaint words cut upon one of them, as we stopped while the door at the rear of the church was being opened. "French." It was the mother tongue of these colonists, Mrs. Weguelin explained to him. "Ah, like Canada!" cried Gazza. "But what a pretty bit is that!" And he stood back to admire a little glimpse, across a street, between tiled roofs and rusty balconies, of another church steeple. "Almost, one would say, the old world," Gazza declared. "Our world is not new," said Mrs. Weguelin, and she passed into the church. Kings Port holds many sacred nooks, many corners, many vistas that should deeply stir the spirit and the heart of all Americans who know and love their country. The passing traveler may gaze up at certain windows there, and see history herself looking out at him, even as she looks out of the windows of Independence Hall in Philadelphia. There are also other ancient buildings in Kings Port, where history is shut up, as in a strong box, such as that stubborn old octagon, the powder magazine of Revolutionary times, which is a chest holding proud memories of blood and war. And then there are the three churches, not strong boxes these, but shrines, where burn the venerable lamps of faith. And of these three houses of God, that one holds the most precious flame, the purest light, which treasures the holy fire that came from France. The English colonists who sat in the other two congregations came to Carolina's soil to better their estate, but it was for liberty of soul, to lift their ardent and exalted prayer to God as their own conscience bade them, and not as any man dictated, that those French colonists sought the New World. No Puritan splendor of independence and indomitable courage outshines theirs. They preached a word as burning as any that Plymouth or Salem ever heard. They were but a handful, yet so fecund was their marvelous zeal that they became the spiritual leaven of their whole community. They are less known than Plymouth and Salem, because men of action, rather than men of letters, have sprung from the loins of the South. But there they stand, a beautiful beacon, shining upon the coasts of our early history. Into their church, then, into the shrine where their small lamp still burns, their devout descendant, Mrs. Weguelin St. Michael, led our party, because in her eyes Kings Port could show nothing more precious and significant. There had been nothing to warn her that Bohm and Charley were Americans who neither knew nor loved their country, but merely Americans who knew their country's wealth and loved to acquire every penny of it that they could. And so, following the steps of our delicate and courteous guide, we entered into the dimness of the little building, and Mrs. Weguelin's voice, lowered to suit the sanctity which the place had for her, began to tell us very quietly and clearly the story of its early days. I knew it, or something of it, from books, but from this little lady's lips it took on a charm and graciousness which made it fresh to me. I listened attentively until I felt, without at first seeing the cause, that dulling of enjoyment, that interference with the receptive attention, which comes at times to one during the performance of music when untimely people come in or go out. Next, I knew that our group of listeners was less compact, and then, as we moved from the first point in the church to a new one, I saw that Bohm and Charley were dropping behind, and I lingered with the intention of bringing them closer. But there was nothing in it. I heard Charley's slow monologue continuing behind me to the silent Bohm. We could have bought the Parsons Road at that time. Gentlemen, I said to them, what is there for us in Tidewater at Kings Port? It was not to be done, and I rejoined Mrs. Weguelin and those of the party who were making some show of attention to her quiet little histories and explanations, and Kitty's was the next voice which I heard ring out. Oh, you must never let it fall to pieces. It's the cunningest little fossil I've seen in the South. So, said Charley behind me, we let the other crowd buy their strategic point, and I guess they know they got a gold brick. I moved away from the financiers. I endeavored not to hear their words, and in this much I was successful. But their inappropriate presence had got, I suppose, upon my nerves. At any rate, go where I would in the little church, or attend as I might, and did, to what Mrs. Weguelin St. Michael said about the tablets, and whatever traditions their inscriptions suggested to her, that quiet, low, persistent banker's voice of Charley's pervaded the building like a draught of cold air. Once, indeed, he addressed Mrs. Weguelin a question. She was telling Beverly, who followed her throughout, protectingly and charmingly, with his most devoted attention and his best manner, the honorable deeds of certain older generations of a family belonging to this congregation, some of whose tombs outside had borne French inscriptions. My mother's family, said Mrs. Weguelin. And nowadays, inquired Beverly, what do they find instead of military careers? There are no more of us nowadays. They were killed in the war. And immediately she smiled, and with her hand she made a light gesture, as if to dismiss this subject from mutual embarrassment and pain. "I might have known better," murmured the understanding Beverly. But Charley now had his question. "How many, did you say?" "How many?" Mrs. Weguelin did not quite understand him. "Were killed," explained Charley. Again there was a little pause before Mrs. Weguelin answered, "My 4 brothers met their deaths." Charley was interested. "And what was the percentage of fatality in their regiments?" "Oh," said Mrs. Weguelin, "we did not think of it in that way." And she turned aside. "Charley," said Kitty with some precipitancy, "do make Mr. Bohm look at the church." And she turned after Mrs. Weguelin. "It is such a gem." But I saw the little lady try to speak and fail, and then I noticed that she was leaning against a window sill. Beverly Rodgers also noticed this, and he hastened to her. "Thank you," she returned to his hasty question. "I am quite well. If you're not tired of it, shall we go on?" "It is such a gem," repeated Kitty, throwing an angry glance at Charley and Bohm. And so we went on. Yes, Kitty did her best to cover it up. Kitty, as she would undoubtedly have said herself, could see a few things. But nobody could cover it up, though Beverly was now vigilant in his efforts to do so. Indeed, replacers cannot be covered up by human agency. They bulge, they loom, they stare, they dominate the road of life, even as their automobiles drive horses and pedestrians to the wall. Bohm, roused from his financial torpor by Kitty's sharp command, did actually turn his eyes upon the church, which he had now been inside for some 20 minutes without noticing. Instinct and long training had given his eye, when it really looked at anything, a particular glance, the glance of the replacer, which plainly calculated, "Can this be made worth money to me?" and which died instantly to a glaze of indifference on seeing that no money could be made. Bohm's eye, accordingly, waked and then glazed. Manners, courtesy, he did not need, not yet. He had looked at them with his replacer glance, and seeing no money in them, had gone on looking at railroads and mines and mills, and bare shoulders and bottles. Should manners and courtesy come some day to mean money to him? Then he could have them in his fashion, so that his admirers and his apologists should alike declare of him, "A rough diamond, but consider what he has made of himself." "After what did you say?" This was the voice of Gazza, addressing Mrs. Weguelin St. Michael. It must be said of Gazza that he, too, made a certain presence of interest in the traditions of Kings Port. "After the revocation of the Edict of Nantes," replied Mrs. Weguelin. "Built it in Savannah," Charley was saying to Bohm, "or Norfolk. This is a good place to bury people in, but not money. Now, the phosphate proposition." Again I dragged my attention by force away from that quiet, relentless monologue, and listened as well as I could to Mrs. Weguelin. There had come to be among us all, I think, Beverly, Kitty, Gazza, and myself, a joint impulse to shield her, to cluster about her, to follow her steps from each little lecture that she finished to the new point where the next lecture began. And we did it, performed our pilgrimage to the end, but there was less and less nature in our performance. I knew, and it was like a dream which I could not stop, that we pressed a little too close, that our questions were a little too eager, that we overprinted our faces with attention. Knowing this did not help, nothing helped, and we went on to the end, seeing ourselves doing it. And it must have been that Mrs. Weguelin saw us likewise. But she was truly admirable in giving no sign. She came out well ahead. The lectures were not hurried. One had no sense of points being skipped to accommodate our unworthiness. It required a previous familiarity with the church to know, as I did, that there was indeed more and more skipping. Yet the little lady played her part so evenly, and with never a falter of voice nor a change in the gentle courtesy of her manner, that I do not think, save for that moment at the window sill, I could have been sure what she thought or how much she noticed. Her face was always so pale; it may well have been all imagination with me that she seemed, when we emerged at last into the light of the street, paler than usual. But I am almost certain that her hand was trembling as she stood receiving the thanks of the party. These thanks were cut a little short by the arrival of one of the automobiles, and at the same time the appearance of Hortense strolling toward us with John Mayrant. Charley had resumed to Bone, "A tax of 25 cents on the ton is nothing with deposits of this richness," when his voice ceased, and looking at him to see the cause, I perceived that his eye was on John, and that his polished fingernail was running meditatively along his thin mustache. Hortense took the matter, whatever the matter was, in hand. "You haven't much time," she said to Charles, who consulted his watch. "Who's coming to see me off?" he inquired. "Where's he going?" I asked Beverly. "She's sending him North," Beverly answered, and then he spoke with his very best simple manner to Mrs. Weguelin St. Michael. "May I not walk home with you after all your kindness?" She was going to say no, for she had had enough of this party, but she looked at Beverly, and his face and his true solicitude won her. She said, "Thank you, if you will," and the two departed together down the shabby street, the little veiled lady in black, and Beverly with his excellent London clothes, and his still more excellent look of respectful, sheltering attention. And now Bohm pronounced the only utterance that I heard fall from his lips during his stay in Kings Port. He looked at the church he had come from, he looked at the neighboring larger church, whose columns stood out at the angle of the street, he looked at the graveyard opposite that, then at the stale, dusty shop of old furniture, and then up the shabby street, where no life or movement was to be seen except the distant forms of Beverly and Mrs. Weguelin St. Michael. Then from a gold cigar case curved to fit his breast pocket, he took a cigar and lighted it from a gold matchbox. Offering none of us a cigar, he placed the case again in his pocket, and holding his lighted cigar a moment with two fingers in his strong glove, he spoke. "This town's worse than Sunday." Then he got into the automobile. They all followed to see Charley off, and he addressed me. "I shall be glad," he said, "if you will make one of a little party on the yacht next Sunday when I come back. And you also," he added to John. Both John and I expressed our acceptance in suitable forms, and the automobile took its way to the train. "Your Kings Port streets," I said, as we walked back toward Mrs. Trevise's, "are not very favorable for automobiles." "No," he returned briefly. I don't remember that either of us found more to say until we had reached my front door. When he asked, "Will the day after tomorrow suit you for Udolpho?" "Whenever you say," I told him. "Weather permitting, of course. But I hope that it will, for after that I suppose my time will not be quite so free." After we had parted, it struck me that this was the first reference to his approaching marriage that John had ever made in my hearing since that day long ago, it seemed long ago at least, when he had come to the Exchange to order the wedding cake, and Eliza La Heu had fallen in love with him at sight. That, in my opinion, looking back now with eyes at any rate partially opened, was what Eliza had done. Had John returned the compliment then, or since? End of chapter 18. Recording by Lois Hill, Cami, Idaho. Chapter 19 of Lady Baltimore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lois Hill. Lady Baltimore by Owen Wister. Chapter 19. Udolpho. It was to me continuously a matter of satisfaction and of interest to see Hortense disturbed, whether for causes real or imaginary, about the security of her title to her lover John. Nor can I say that my misinterpreted bunch of roses diminished this satisfaction. I should have been glad to know if the accomplished young woman had further probed that question and discovered the truth, but it seemed scarce likely that she could do this without the help of one of three persons, Eliza and myself, who knew all, or John, who knew nothing. For the up-country bride, and whatever other people in Kings Port there were to whom the bride might gaily recite the tale of my roses, were none of them likely to encounter Miss Rieppe. Their paths and hers would not meet until they met in church at the wedding of Hortense and John. No, she could not have found out the truth, for never in the world would she, at this 11th hour, risk a conversation with John upon a subject so full of well-packed explosives, and so she must be simply keeping on both him and Eliza an eye as watchful as lay in her power. As for Charley, what bait, what persuasion, what duress she had been able to find that took him at an hour so critical from her side to New York, I could not in the least conjecture. Had she said to the little banker, "Go, because I must think it over alone"? It did not seem strong enough. Or had she said, "Go, and on your return you shall have my answer"? Not adequate either, I thought. Or had it been, "If you don't go, it shall be no, today and forever"? This last was better, but there was no telling, nor did Beverly Rodgers, to whom I propounded all my theories, have any notion of what was between Hortense and Charley. He only knew that Charley was quite aware of the existence of John, but had always been merely amused at the notion of him. "So have you been merely amused?" I reminded him. "Not since that look I saw her give him, old chap. I know she wants him, only not why she wants him. And Charley, you know, well, of course poor Charley's a banker, just a banker and no more, and a banker is merely the ace in the same pack where the drummer is the two spot. Our American civilization should be called Drummer's Delight, and there's nothing in your fire eater to delight a drummer. He's a gentleman, he'll be only so rich, and he's away back out of the limelight, while poor old Charley's a bounder, and worth 40 millions anyhow, and right in the center of the glare. How should he see any danger in John? I wonder if he hasn't begun to. Well, perhaps. He and Hortense have been talking business. I know that. Oh, and why do you think she said he must go to New York? To make a better deal for the fire eater's phosphates than his fuddling old trustee here was going to close with. Charley said that could be arranged by telegram, but she made him go himself. She's extraordinary. He'll arrive in town tomorrow. He'll leave next day. He'll reach here by the Southern on Saturday night in time for our Sunday yacht picnic, and then something has got to happen, I should think. Here was another key, unlocking a further piece of knowledge for me. I had not been able to guess why Hortense should be keeping Charley on. But how natural was this policy when understood clearly! She still needed Charley's influence in the world of affairs. Charley's final service was to be the increasing of his successful rival's fortune. I wondered what Charley would do when the full extent of his usefulness dawned upon him. And with wonder renewed I thought of General Rieppe and this daughter he had managed to beget. Surely the mother of Hortense, whoever she may have been, must have been a very richly endowed character. "Something has most certainly got to happen, and soon," I said to Beverly Rodgers, "especially if my busy boarding house bodies are right in saying that the invitations for the wedding are to be out on Monday." Well, I had Friday, I had Udolpho, and there, while on that excursion, when I should be alone with John Mayrant during many hours, and especially the hours of deep, confidential night, I swore to myself on oath I would say to the boy the last word, up to the verge of offense, that my wits could devise. Apart from a certain dramatic excitement as of battle between Hortense and me, I truly wished to help him out of the miserable mistake his wrong standard, his chivalry gone perverted, was spurring him on to make. And I had a comic image of myself summoning Miss Josephine, summoning Miss Eliza, summoning Mrs. Gregory and Mrs. Weguelin, and the whole company of aunts and cousins, and handing to them the rescued John with the single but sufficient syllable, "There." He was in apparent spirits, was John, at that hour of our departure for Udolpho. He pretended so well that I was for a while altogether deceived. He had wished to call for me with the conveyance in which he should drive us out into the lonely country through the sunny afternoon, but instead I chose to walk round to where he lived, and where I found him stuffing beneath the seats of the vehicle the baskets and the parcels which contained the provisions for our ample supper. "I have never seen you drink hearty yet, and now I purpose to," said John. As the packing was finishing, Miss Josephine St. Michael came by, and the sight of the erect old lady reminded me that of all Kings Port figures known to me and seen in the garden, paying their visit of ceremony to Hortense, she alone, She and Eliza La Heu had been absent. Eliza's declining to share in that was well nigh inevitable, but Miss Josephine was another matter. Perhaps she had considered her sister's going there to be enough. At any rate, she had not been party to the surrender, and this gave me whimsical satisfaction. Moreover, it had evidently occasioned no ruffle in the affectionate relations between herself and John. "John," said she, "as you drive by, do get me a plumber." "Much better get a burglar, Aunt Josephine. Cheaper in the end, and neater work." It was thus, at the outset, that I came to believe John's spirits were high, and this illusion he successfully kept up until after we had left the plumber and Kings Port several sordid miles behind us. The approach to Kings Port this way lies through dirtiest Africa. John was loquacious. John discoursed upon the Replacers. Mrs. Weguelin St. Michael had quite evidently expressed to her own circle what she thought of them. And the town, in consequence, although it did not see them or their automobiles, because it appeared they were gone some 20 miles inland upon an excursion to a resort where there was a large hotel and a little variety in the way of some tourists of the Replacer stripe, the town kept them well in its mind's eye. The automobiles would have sufficed to bring them into disrepute, but Kings Port had a better reason in their conduct in the church. And John found many things to say to me as we drove along about Bohm and Charlie and Kitty. Gaza he forgot, although, as shall appear in its place, Gaza was likely to live a long while in his memory. Beverly Rogers he, of course, recognized as being a gentleman. It was clear that Beverly met with Kings Port's approval. And from his Newport experiences, John was able to make out quite as well as if he had heard Beverly explain it himself, the whole wise, philosophic system of joining with the Replacers in order that you be not replaced yourself. In his shoes, mightn't I do the same? He surmised. I fear I'm not as Spartan as my aunts, only pray don't mention it to them. And then, because I had been answering him with single syllables, or with nods, or not at all, he taxed me with my taciturnity. He even went so far as to ask me what thoughts kept me so silent, which I did not tell him. "I am wondering," I told him instead, "how much they steal every week." "Those financiers?" "Yes. Bohm is president of an insurance company, and Charlie's a director, and reorganizes railroads." "Well, if other people share your pleasant opinion of them, how do they get elected?" "Other people share their pleasant spoils. Senators, vestrymen. You can't be sure who you're sitting next to at dinner any more. Come live North. You'll find the only safe way is never to know anybody worth more than 5 millions, if you wish to keep the criminal classes off your visiting list." This made him merry. "Put 'em in jail, then." "Ah, the jail," I returned. "It's the great American joke. It reverses the rule of our smart society. Only those who have no incomes are admitted." "But what do you have laws and lawyers for?" "To keep the rich out of jail. It's called professional etiquette." "Your picture flatters." "You flatter me. It's only a photograph. Come North and see." "One might think from your account the American had rather be bad than good." "Oh, dear, no! The American had much rather be good than bad." "Your admission amazes me." "But also the American had rather be rich than good. And he is having his wish. And money's golden hand is tightening on the throat of liberty while the labor union stabs liberty in the back. For trusts and unions are both trying to kill liberty. And the soul of Uncle Sam has turned into a dollar inside his great, big, strong, triumphant flesh, so that even his new religion, his own special invention, his last offering to the creeds of the world, his gatherer of converted hordes, his Christian Science, is based upon physical benefit." John touched the horses. "You're particularly cheerful today." "No, I merely summarize what I'm seeing." "Well, a moral awakening will come," he declared. "Inevitably. Tomorrow, perhaps. The flesh has had a good, long, prosperous day, and the hour of the spirit must be near striking. And the moral awakening will be followed by a moral slumber, since, in the uncomprehended scheme of things, slumber seems necessary. And you needn't pull so long a face, Mr. Mayrant, because the slumber will be followed by another moral awakening. The alcoholic society girl you don't like will very probably give birth to a water-drinking daughter, who in her turn may produce a bibulous progeny. How often must I tell you that nothing is final?" John Mayrant gave the horses a somewhat vicious lash after these last words of mine, and as he made no retort to them, we journeyed some little distance in silence through the mild, enchanting light of the sun. My deliberate allusion to alcoholic girls had made plain what I had begun to suspect. I could now discern that his cloak of gayety had fallen from him, leaving bare the same harassed spirit, the same restless mood, which had been his upon the last occasion when we had talked at length together upon some of the present social and political phases of our republic, that day of the new bridge and the advent of Hortense. Only, upon that day, he had by his manner in some subtle fashion conveyed to me a greater security in my discretion than I felt him now to entertain. His many observations about the Replacers, with always the significant and conspicuous omission of Hortense, proved more and more, as I thought it over, that his state was unsteady. Even now he did not long endure silence between us, yet the eagerness which he threw into our discussions did not, it seemed to me, so much proceed from present interest in their subjects, though interest there was at times, as from anxiety lest one particular subject ever present with him should creep in unawares. So much I, at any rate, concluded, and bided my time for the creeping in unawares, content meanwhile to parry some of the reproaches which he now and again cast at me with an earnestness real or feigned. We had made now considerable progress, and were come to a space of sand and cabins and intersecting railroad tracks, where freight cars and locomotives stood, and negroes of all shapes, but of one lowering and ragged appearance, lounged and stared. "There used to be a murder here about once a day," said John, "before the dispensary system. Now it is about once a week." "That law is of benefit, then?" I inquired. "To those who drink the whiskey, possibly; certainly to those who sell it." And he condensed for me the long story of the state dispensary, which, in brief, appeared to be that South Carolina had gone into the liquor business. The profits were to pay for compulsory education. The liquor was to be pure. Society and sobriety were to be advanced. Such had been the threefold promise, of which the threefold fulfillment was defeat of the compulsory education bill, a political monopoly enriching favored distillers, and lately, said John, a thoroughly democratic whiskey for the plain people. Pay 10 cents for a bottle of X, if you're curious. It may not poison you, but the murders are coming up again." "What a delightful example of government ownership!" I exclaimed. But John in Kings Port was not in the way of hearing that cure-all policy discussed, and I therefore explained it to him. He did not seem to grasp my explanation. "I don't see how it would change anything," he remarked, "beyond switching the stealing from one set of hands to another." I put on a face of concern. "What? You don't believe in our patent American shortcuts?" "Shortcuts?" "Certainly. Shortcuts to universal happiness, universal honesty, universal everything. For instance, don't make a boy study 4 years for a college degree. Just cut the time in half, and you've got a shortcut to education. Write it down that man is equal. That settles it. You'll notice how equal he is at once. Write it down that the Negro shall vote. You'll observe how instantly he is fit for the suffrage. Now they want it written down that government shall take all the wicked corporations, because then corruption will disappear from the face of the earth. You'll find the farmers presently having it written down that all hens must hatch their eggs in a week. And next, a league of earnest women will advocate a constitutional amendment that men only shall bring forth children. Oh, we Americans are very thorough." And I laughed. But John's face was not gay. "Well," he mused, "South Carolina took a short cut to pure liquor and sober citizens, and reached instead a new den of thieves. Is the whole country sick?" "Sick to the marrow, my friend, but young and vigorous still. A nation in its long life has many illnesses before the one it dies of. But we shall need some strong medicine if we do not get well soon." "What kind?" "Oh, that's beyond anyone. And we have several things the matter with us. As bad a case, for example, of complacency as I've met in history. Complacency's a very dangerous disease, seldom got rid of without the purge of a great calamity. And worse, where does our dishonesty begin and where end? The boy goes to college, and there in football it awaits him. He graduates, and in the downtown office it smirks at him. He rises into the confidence of his superiors, the town's chief citizens, and finds their gray hairs crowned with it, the very men he has looked up to, believed in, his ideals, his examples, the merchant prince, the railroad magnate, the president of insurance companies, all dirty rascals. Presently he faces worldly success or failure, and then, in the new ocean of mind that has swallowed morals up, he sinks with his isolated honesty like a fool, or swims to respectability with his brother knaves. And into this mess the immigrant sewage of Europe is steadily pouring. Such is our continent today, with all its fair winds and tides and fields favorable to us, and only our shallow, complacent, dishonest selves against us. But don't let these considerations make you gloomy, for I must say it again, nothing is final. And even if we rot before we ripen, which would be a wholly novel phenomenon, we shall have made our contribution to mankind in demonstrating by our collapse that the sow's ear belongs with the rest of the animal and not in the voting booth or the legislature, and that the doctrine of universal suffrage should have waited until men were born honest and equal. That in itself would be a memorable service to have rendered. We had come into the divine sad stillness of the woods, where the warm sunlight shone through the gray moss, lighting the curtained solitudes away and away into the depths of the golden afternoon. And somewhere amid the miles of sleeping wilderness sounded the hoarse honk of the automobile. The replacers were abroad, enjoying what they could in this country where they did not belong, and which did not as yet belong to them. Once again we heard their honk off to our left from a farther distance, and I am glad to say that we did not see them at all. "If," said John Mayrant, "what you have said is true, the nation had better get on its knees and pray God to give it grace." I looked at the boy and saw that his countenance had grown very fine. "The act," I said, "would bring grace wherever it comes from." "Yes," he assented. "If in the stars and awfulness of space there's nothing, that does not trouble me, for my greater self is inside me, safe, and our country has a greater self somewhere. Think." "I do not have to think," I replied, "when I know the nobleness we have risen to at times. And I," he pursued, "happen to believe it is not all only stars and space, and that God, as much as any shipbuilder, rejoices to watch every tiniest boat meet and brave the storm." Out of his troubles he had brought such mood, sweetness instead of bitterness. He was saying as plainly as if his actual words said it, "Misfortune has come to me, and I am going to make the best of it." His nobleness, his moral elegance, compelled him to see this, and I envied him, not sure if I myself thus placed would acquit myself so well. And there was in his sweetness a contagion that strangely reconciled me to the troubled aspects of our national hour. I thought, invisible among our 80 millions, there is a quiet legion living untainted in the depths, while the yellow rich, the prismatic scum and bubbles boil on the surface. Yes, he had accidentally helped me, and I wished doubly that I might help him. It was well enough he should feel he must not shirk his duty, but how much better if he could be led to see that marrying where he did not love was no duty of his. I knew what I had to say to him, but lacked the beginning of it. And of this beginning I was in search as we drove up among the live oaks of Udolpho to the little clubhouse, or hunting lodge, where a negro and his wife received us and took the baskets and set about preparing supper. My beginning sat so heavily upon my attention that I took scant notice of Udolpho as we walked about its adjacent grounds in the twilight before supper, and John Mayrant pointed out to me its fine old trees, its placid stream, and bade me admire the snug character of the hunting lodge, buried away for bachelors' delights deep in the heart of the pleasant forest. I heard him indulging in memories and anecdotes of date sittings after long hunts, but I was myself always on a hunt for my beginning, and none of his words clearly reached my intelligence until I was aware of his reciting an excellently pertinent couplet: "If you would hold your father's land, you must wash your throat before your hand," and found myself standing by the lodge table, upon which he had set two glasses, containing, I soon ascertained, gin, vermouth, orange bitters, and a cherry at the bottom, all which he had very skillfully mingled himself in the happiest proportions. "The poetry," he remarked, "is hereditary in my family." And setting down the empty glasses, we also washed our hands. A moon half grown looked in at the window from the filmy darkness, and John, catching sight of it, paused with the wet soap in his hand and stared out at the dimly visible trees. "Oh, the times," he murmured to himself, gazing long, and then with a sort of start he returned to the pleasant moment, and rinsed and dried his hands. Presently we were sitting at the table, pledging each other in well-cooled champagne, and it was not long after this that not only the negro who waited on us was plainly reveling in John's remarks, but also the cook, with her bandanaed ebony head poked round the corner of the kitchen door, was doing her utmost to lose no word of this entertainment. For John, taking up the young and the old, the quick and the dead, of masculine Kings Port, proceeded to narrate their private exploits, until by coffee time he had unrolled for me the richest tapestry of gaieties that I remember, and I sat without breath, tearful and aching, while the two negroes had retired far into the kitchen to muffle their emotions. "Tom! Oh, Tom! You, Tom!" called John Mayrant, and after the man had come from the kitchen, "You may put the punch bowl and things on the table, and clear away, and go to bed. My great uncle Marston Chartain," he continued to me, "was of eccentric taste, and for the last 20 years of his life never had anybody to dinner but the undertaker." He paused at this point to mix the punch, and then resumed, "But for all that, he appears to have been a lively old gentleman to the end, and left us his version of a saying which is considered by some people an improvement on the original. Cherchez la femme. Uncle Marston had it, hunt the other woman. Don't go too fast with that punch, it isn't as gentle as it seems." But John and his Uncle Marston had between them given me my beginning, and as I sat sipping my punch, I ceased to hear the anecdotes which followed. I sat sipping and smoking, and was presently aware of the deepening silence of the night, and of John no longer at the table, but by the window, looking out into the forest, and muttering once more, "Oh, the times, the times." "It's always a triangle," I began. He turned round from his window. "Triangle?" He looked at my glass of punch and then at me. "Go easy with the bombo," he repeated. "Bombo?" I echoed. "You call this bombo? You don't know how remarkable that is, but that's because you don't know Aunt Carola, who is very remarkable too. Well, never mind her now. Point is, it's always a triangle." "I haven't a doubt of it," he replied. "There, you're right, and so was your uncle. He knew. Triangle." Here I found myself nodding portentously at John, and beating the table with my finger very solemnly. He stood by his window, seeming to wait for me. And now everything in the universe grew perfectly clear to me. I rose on mastering tides of thought, and all problems lay disposed of at my feet, while delicious strength and calm floated in my brain and being. Nothing was difficult for me. But I was getting away from the triangle, and there was John waiting at the window, and I mustn't say too much, mustn't say too much. My will reached out and caught the triangle and brought it close, and I saw it all perfectly clear again. "What are they all?" I said. "The old romances. You take Paris and Helen and Menelaus. What's that? You take Launcelot and Arthur and Guinevere. You take Paola and Francesca and her husband, what's his name, or Tristram and Iseult and Mark. 2 men, 1 woman, triangle and trouble. Other way around, you get Tannhauser and Venus and Elizabeth. 2 women, 1 man, more triangle and more trouble. Yes." And I nodded at him again. The tide of my thought was pulling me hard away from this to other important world problems, but my will held, struggling, and I kept to it. "You wait," I told him. "I know what I mean. Trouble is, so hard to advise him right." "Advise who right?" inquired John Mayrant. It helped me wonderfully. My will gripped my floating thoughts and held them to it. "Friend of mine in trouble, though why he asks me when I'm not married. I'd be married now, you know, but afraid of only one wife. Man doesn't love twice. Loves thrice, four, six, lots of times, but they say only one wife. Ought to be two, anyhow. Much easier for man to marry then." "Wouldn't it be rather immoral?" John asked. Morality is a queer thing, like kaleidoscope. New patterns all the time. Abraham and wives, perfectly respectable. You take pharaohs or kings of that sort, married own sisters. All right then. Perfectly horrible now, of course. But you ask men about two wives. They'd say something to be said for that idea. Only there are the women, you know. They'd never. But I'm going to tell my friend he's doing wrong. Going to write him tonight. Where's ink?" "It won't go tonight," said John. "What are you going to tell him?" "Going to tell him since only one wife. Wicked not to break his engagement." John looked at me very hard as he stood by the window, leaning on the sill. But my will was getting all the while a stronger hold, and my thoughts were less and less inclined to stray to other world problems. Moreover, below the confusion that still a little reigned in them was the primal cunning of the old Adam, the native man, quite untroubled and alert. It saw John's look at me, and it prompted my course. "Yes," I said, "he wants the truth from me. Where's his letter? No harm reading you without names," and I fumbled in my pocket. "Letter gone. Never mind. Facts are: friends asked girl. Girl said yes. Now he thinks he's bound by that." "He thinks right," said John. "Not a bit of it. You take Tannhauser. Engagement to Venus, all a mistake. Perfectly proper to break it. Much more than proper. Only honorable thing he could do. I'm going to write it to him. Where's ink?" And I got up. John came from his window and sat down at the table. His glass was empty, his cigar gone out, and he looked at me. But I looked round the room for the ink, noting in my search the big fireplace, simple, wooden, unornamented, but generous, and the plain plaster walls of the lodge, whereon hung 2 or 3 old prints of game birds. And all the while I saw John out of the corner of my eye, looking at me. He spoke first. "Your friend has given his word to a lady. He must stand by it like a gentleman." "Lot of difference," I returned, still looking around the room, "between spirit and letter. If his heart has broken the word, his lips can't make him a gentleman." John brought his fist down on the table. "He had no business to get engaged to her. He must take the consequences." That blow of the fist on the table brought my thoughts wholly clear and fixed on the one subject. My will had no longer to struggle with them. They worked of themselves in just the way that I wanted them to do. "If he's a gentleman, he must stand to his word," John repeated, "unless she releases him." I fumbled again for my letter. "That's just about what he says himself," I rejoined, sitting down. "He thinks he ought to take the consequences." "Of course." John Mayrant's face was very stern as he sat in judgment on himself. "But why should she take the consequences?" I asked. "What consequences?" "Being married to a man who doesn't want her, all her life, until death them do part. How's that? Having the daily humiliation of his indifference and the world's knowledge of his indifference. How's that? Perhaps having the further humiliation of knowing that his heart belongs to another woman. How's that? That's not what a girl bargains for. His standing to his word is not an act of honor, but a deception. And in talking about taking the consequences, he's patting his personal sacrifice on the back and forgetting all about her and the sacrifice he's putting her to. What's the brief suffering of a broken engagement to that? No, the true consequences that a man should shoulder for making such a mistake is the poor opinion that society holds of him for placing a woman in such a position. And to free her is the most honorable thing he can do. Her dignity suffers less so than if she were a wife chained down to perpetual disregard. John, after a silence, said, "That is a very curious view." "That is the view I shall give my friend," I answered. "I shall tell him that in keeping on, he is not at bottom honestly thinking of the girl and her welfare, but of himself and the public opinion he's afraid of, if he breaks his engagement. And I shall tell him that if I'm in church and they come to the place where they ask if any man knows just cause or impediment, I shall probably call out, 'He does,' His heart's not in it. This is not marriage that he's committing. You're pronouncing your blessing upon a fraud." John sat now a long time silent, holding his extinct cigar. The lamp was almost burned dry. We had blown out the expiring candles some while since. "That is a very curious view," he repeated. "I should like to hear what your friend says in answer." This finished our late sitting. We opened the door and went out for a brief space into the night to get its pure breath into our lungs and look to the distant place where the moon had sailed. Then we went to bed, or rather I did, for the last thing that I remembered was John standing by the window of our bedroom, still dressed, looking out into the forest. End of chapter 19. Recording by Lois Hill, Kamei, Idaho. Chapter 20 of Lady Baltimore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lois Hill. Lady Baltimore by Owen Wister. Chapter 20. What She Wanted Him For. He was neither at the window, nor in his bed, nor anywhere else to be seen, when I opened my eyes upon the world next morning. Nor did any answer come when I called his name. I raised myself and saw outside the great branches of the wood, bathed from top to trunk in a sunshine that was no early morning's light, and upon this the silence of the house spoke plainly to me, not of man still sleeping, but of man long risen and gone about his business. I stepped barefoot across the wooden floor to where lay my watch, but it marked an unearthly hour, for I had neglected to wind it at the end of our long and convivial evening, of which my head was now giving me some news, and then I saw a note addressed to me from John Mayrant. "You are a good sleeper," it began, "but my conscience is clear as to the Bombo, called by some kill devil, about which I hope you will remember that I warned you." He hoped I should remember. Of course I remembered everything. Why did he say that? An apology for his leaving me followed. He had been obliged to take the early train because of the custom house, where he was serving his final days. They would give me breakfast whenever I should be ready for it, and I was to make free of the place. I had better visit the old church (they had orders about the keys) and drive myself into Kings Port after lunch. The horses would know the way if I did not. It was the boy's closing sentence which fixed my attention wholly, took it away from Kill Devil Bombo and my Aunt Carola's commission, for the execution of which I now held the clue, and sent me puzzling for the right interpretation of his words. "I believe that you will help your friend by that advice which startled me last night, but which I now begin to see more in than I did. Only between alternate injuries he may find it harder to choose which is the least he can inflict, than you, who look on, find it. For in following your argument he benefits himself so plainly that the benefit to the other person is very likely obscured to him. But if you wish to, tell him a Southern gentleman would feel he ought to be shot either way. That's the honorable price for changing your mind in such a case." No interpretation of this came to me. I planned and carried out my day according to his suggestion: a slow dressing with much cold water, a slow breakfast with much good hot coffee, a slow wandering beneath the dreamy branches of Udolpho. This course cleared my head of the Bombo, and brought back to me our whole evening, and every word I had said to John, except that I had lost the solution which last night the triangle had held for me. At that moment the triangle, and my whole dealing with the subject of monogamy, had seemed to contain the simplicity of genius, but it had all gone now, and I couldn't get it back. Only what I had contrived to say to John about his own predicament had been certainly well said. I would say that over again today. It was the boy and the meaning of his words which escaped me still, baffled me, and formed the whole subject of my attention, even when I was inside the Turncreek church, so that I retained nothing of that save a general quaintness, a general loneliness, a little deserted, forgotten token of human doings long since done, standing on its little acre of wilderness amid that solitude which suggests the departed presence of man, and which is so much more potent in the flavor of its desolation than the virgin wilderness whose solitude is still waiting for man to come. It made no matter whether John had believed in the friend to whom I intended writing advice, or had seen through and accepted in good part my maneuver. He had considered my words, that was the point, and he had not slept in his bed, but on it, if sleep had come to him at all. This I found out while dressing. Several times I read his note over. Between alternate injuries, he may find it harder to choose. This was not an answer to me, but an explanation of his own perplexity. At times it sounded almost like an appeal, as if he were saying, "Do not blame me for not being convinced." And if it was such appeal, why, then, taken with his resolve to do right at any cost, and his night of inward contention, it was poignant. "I believe that you will help your friend." Those words sounded better, but tell him a Southern gentleman ought to be shot either way. What was the meaning of this? A chill import rose from it into my thoughts, but that I dismissed. To die on account of Hortense! Such a thing was not to be conceived. And yet, given a high-strung nature, not only trapped by its own standards, but also wrought upon during many days by increasing exasperation and unhappiness, while helpless in the trap, and with no other outlook but the trap, the chill import returned to me more than once, and was reasoned away, as, with no attention to my surroundings, I took a pair of oars and got into a boat belonging to the lodge, and rowed myself slowly among the sluggish windings of Tern Creek. Whence come those thoughts that we ourselves feel shame at? It shamed me now, as I pulled my boat along, that I should have thoughts of John which needed banishing. What tale would this be to remember of a boy's life, that he gave it to buy freedom from a pledge which need never have been binding? What pearl was this to cast before the sophisticated Hortense? Such act would be robbed of its sadness by its absurdity. Yet surely the bitterest tragedies are those of which the central anguish is lost amid the dust of surrounding paltriness. If such a thing should happen here, no one but myself would have seen the lonely figure of John Mayrant standing by the window and looking out into the dark quiet of the wood. His name would be passed down for a little while as the name of a fool, and then he would be forgotten. "I believe that you will help your friend." Yes, he had certainly written that, and it now came to me that I might have said to him one thing more. Had he given Hortense the chance to know what his feelings to her had become? But he would merely have answered that here it was the duty of a gentleman to lie. Or had he possibly, at Newport, ever become her lover too much for any escaping now? Had his dead passion once put his honor in a pawn which only marriage could redeem? This might fit all that had come so far, and still, with such a two as they, I should forever hold the boy the woman's victim. But this did not fit what came after. Perhaps it was the late sitting of the night before, and the hushed and strange solitude of my surroundings now, that had laid my mind open to all these thoughts, which my reason, in dealing with, answered continually, one by one, yet which returned, requiring to be answered again. For there are times when our uncomfortable eyes see through the appearances we have arranged for daily life, into the actualities which lie forever behind them. Going about thus in my boat, I rode sleepiness into myself, and pushed into a nook where shade from some thick growth hid the boat and me from the sun, and there, almost enmeshed in the deep lattice of green, I placed my coat beneath my head, and prone in the boat's bottom I drifted into slumber. Once or twice my oblivion was pierced by the roaming honk of the automobile, but with no more than the half-melted consciousness that the replacers were somewhere in the wood, oblivion closed over me again, and when it altogether left me, it was because of voices near me on the water or on the bank. Their calls and laughter pushed themselves into my drowsiness, and soon after I grew aware that the replacers were come here to see what was to be seen at Udolpho, the club, the old church, a country place with a fine avenue, and that it was the church they now couldn't get into, because my visit had disturbed the usual whereabouts of the key, of which Gazza was now going in search. I could have told him where to find it, but it pleased me not to disturb myself for this, as I listened to him assuring Kitty that it was probably in the cabin beyond the bridge, but not to be alarmed if he did not immediately return with it. Kitty, not without audible mirth, assured him that they should not be alarmed at all, to which the voice of Hortense supplemented, "Not at all." They were evidently in a boat, which Hortense herself was rowing, and which she seemed to bring to the bank, where I gathered that Kitty got out and sat, while Hortense remained in the boat. There was the little talk and movement which goes with borrowing of a cigarette, a little exclamation about not falling out, accompanied by the rattle of a displaced oar, and then stillness, and the smell of tobacco smoke. Presently Kitty spoke. "Charley will be back tonight." To this I heard no reply. "What did his telegram say?" Kitty inquired after another silence. "It's all right." This was Hortense. Her slow, rich murmur was as deliberate as always. "Mr. Bohm knew it would be," said Kitty. "He said it wouldn't take 5 minutes' talk from Charley to get a contract worth double what they were going to accept." After this, nothing came to me for several minutes, save the odor of the cigarettes. Of course, there was now but one proper course for me, namely, to utter a discreet cough, and thus warn them that someone was within earshot. But I didn't. I couldn't. Strength failed. Curiosity won. My baser nature triumphed here, and I deliberately remained lying quiet and hidden. It was the act of no gentleman, you will say. Well, it was, and I must simply confess to it, hoping that I am not the only gentleman in the world who has, on occasion, fallen beneath himself. "Hortense Rieppe," began Kitty, "what do you intend to say to my brother after what he has done about those phosphates?" "He is always so kind," murmured Hortense. "Well, you know what it means." "Means?" "If you persist in this folly, you'll drop out." Hortense chose another line of speculation. "I wonder why your brother is so sure of me." "Charley is a set man, and I've never seen him so set on anything as on you, Hortense Rieppe." "He is always so kind," murmured Hortense again. "He's a man you'll always know just where to find," declared Kitty. "Charley is safe. He'll never take you by surprise, never fly out, never do what other people don't do, never make anyone stare at him by the way he looks, or the way he acts, or anything he says, or why, how you can hesitate between those two men after that ridiculous, childish, conspicuous, unusual scene on the bridge!" "Unusual, yes," said Hortense. Kitty's eloquence and voice mounted together. "I should think it was unusual, tearing people's money up, and making a rude, awkward fuss that everybody had to smooth over as hard as they could. Why, even Mr. Rogers says that sort of thing isn't done, and you're always saying he knows." "No," said Hortense, "it isn't done." "Well, I've never seen anything approaching such behavior in our set. And he was ready to go further. Nobody knows where it might have gone to if Charley's perfect coolness hadn't rebuked him and brought him to his senses. That's where it is. That's what I mean, Hortense, by saying you could always feel safe with Charley." Hortense put in a languid word. "I think I should always feel safe with Mr. Mayrant." But Kitty was a simple soul. "Indeed you couldn't, Hortense. I assure you that you're mistaken. There's where you get so wrong about men sometimes. I have been studying that boy for your sake ever since we got here, and I know him through and through. And I tell you, you cannot count upon him. He has not been used to our ways, and I see no promise of his getting used to them. He will stay capable of outbreaks like that horrid one on the bridge. Wherever you take him, wherever you put him, no matter how much you show him of us and the way we don't allow conspicuous things like that to occur, believe me, Hortense, he'll never learn. He'll never smooth down. You may brush his hair flat and keep him appearing like other people for a while, but a time will come, something will happen, and that boy'll be conspicuous. Charley would never be conspicuous." "No," assented Hortense. Kitty urged her point. "Why, I never saw or heard of anything like that on the bridge. That is, among us." "No," assented Hortense again, and her voice dropped lower with each statement. One always sees the same thing, always hears the same thing, always the same thing." These last almost inaudible words sank away into the silent pool of Hortense's meditation. "Have another cigarette," said Kitty. "You've let yours fall into the water." I heard them moving a little, and then they must have resumed their seats. "You'll drop out of it," Kitty now pursued. "Into what shall I drop?" "Just being asked to the big things everybody else goes to and nobody counts. For even with the way Charlie has arranged about the phosphates, it will not be enough to keep you in our swim, just by itself. He'll weigh more than his money because he'll stay different. Too different." "He was not so different last summer." "Because he was not there long enough, my dear. He learned bridge quickly, and of course he had seen champagne before, and nobody had time to notice him. But he'll be married now, and they will notice him, and they won't want him. To think of your dropping out!" Kitty became very earnest. "To think of not seeing you among us! You'll be in none of the small things. You'll never be asked to stay at the smart houses. Why, not even your name will be in the paper. Not a foreigner you entertain, not a dinner you give, not a thing you wear, will ever be described next morning. And Charlie's so set on you, and you're so just exactly made for each other, and it would all be so splendid and cozy and jolly. And to throw all this away for that crude boy!" Kitty's disdain was high at the thought of John. Hortense took a little time over it. "Once," she then stated, "he told me he could drown in my hair as joyfully as the Duke of Clarence did in his butt of Malmsey wine." Kitty gave a little scream. "Did you let him?" "One has to guard one's value at times." Kitty's disdain for John increased. "How crude!" Hortense did not make any answer. "How crude!" Kitty, after some silence, repeated. She seemed to have found the right word. Steps sounded upon the bridge, and the voice of Gazza cried out that the stupid key was at the imbecile clubhouse, whither he was now going for it, and not to be alarmed. Their voices answered reassuringly, and Gazza was heard growing distant, singing some little song. Kitty was apparently unable to get away from John's crudity. "He actually said that?" "Yes." "Where was it? Tell me about it, Hortense." "We were walking in the country on that occasion." Kitty still lingered with it. "Did he look— I've never had any man— I wonder if— How did you feel?" "Not disagreeably," and Hortense permitted herself to laugh musically. Kitty's voice at once returned to the censorious tone. "Well, I call such language as that very, very—" Hortense helped her. "Operatic?" "He could never be taught in those ways either," declared Kitty. "You would find his ardor always untrained, provincial." Once more Hortense abstained from making any answer. Kitty grew superior. "Well, if that's to your taste, Hortense Rieppe." "It was none of it like Charlie," murmured Hortense. "I should think not! Charlie's not crude. What do you see in that man?" "I like the way his hair curls above his ears." For this Kitty found nothing but an impatient exclamation. And now the voice of Hortense sank still deeper in dreaminess, down to where the truth lay, and from those depths came the truth, flashing upward through the drowsy words she spoke. "I think I want him for his innocence." What light these words may have brought to Kitty I had no chance to learn, for the voice of Gazza returning with the key put an end to this conversation. But I doubted if Kitty had it in her to fathom the nature of Hortense. Kitty was like a trim little clock that could tick tidily on an ornate shelf. She could go, she could keep up with time, with the rapid epoch to which she belonged, but she didn't really have many works. I think she would have scoffed at that last languorous speech as a piece of Hortense's nonsense, and that is why Hortense uttered it aloud. She was safe from being understood. But in my ears it sounded the note of revelation, the simple central secret of Hortense's fire, a flame fed overmuch with experience, with sophistication, grown cold under the ministrations of adroitness, and lighted now by the crudity of John's love-making. And when, after an interval, I had rowed my boat back, and got into the carriage, and started on my long drive from Udolpho to Kings Port, I found that there was almost nothing about all this which I did not know now. Hortense, like most riddles when you are told the answer, was clear. I think I want him for his innocence. Yes, she was tired of love-making, whose down had been rubbed off. She hungered for love-making with the down still on, even if she must pay for it with marriage. Who shall say if her enlightened and modern eye could not look beyond such marriage, when it should grow monotonous, to divorce? End of chapter 20. Recording by Lois Hill, Kamei, Idaho. Chapter 21 of Lady Baltimore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lois Hill. Lady Baltimore by Owen WISTER. Chapter 21. Hortense's cigarette goes out. John was the riddle that I could not read. Among my last actions of this day was one that had been almost my earliest, and bedtime found me staring at his letter as I stood half undressed by my table. The calm moon brought back Udolpho and what had been said there, as it now shone down upon the garden where Hortense had danced. I stared at John's letter as if its words were new to me, instead of being words that I could have fluently repeated from beginning to end without an error. It was as if, by virtue of mere gazing at the document, I hoped to wring more meaning from it, to divine what had been in the mind which had composed it. But instead of this, I seemed to get less from it instead of more. Had the boy's purpose been to mystify me, he could scarce have done better. I think that he had no such intention, for it would have been wholly unlike him. But I saw no sign in it that I had really helped him, had really shaken his old quixotic resolve. Nor did I see any of his having found a new way of his own out of the trap. I could not believe that the dark road of escape had taken any lodgment in his thought, but had only passed over it like a cloud with a heavy shadow. But these are surmises at the best. If John had formed any plan, I can never know it, and Juno's remarks at breakfast on Sunday morning sounded strange, like something 1,000 miles away. For she spoke of the wedding and of the fact that it would certainly be a small one. She went over the names of the people who would have to be invited, and doubted if she were one of these. But if she should be, then she would go, for the sake of Miss Josephine St. Michael, she declared. In short, it was perfectly plain that Juno was much afraid of being left out, and that wild horses could not drag her away from it if an invitation came to her. But, as I say, this side of the wedding seemed to have nothing to do with it, when I thought of all that lay beneath. My one interest today was to see John Mayrant, to get from him, if not by some word, then by some look or intonation, a knowledge of what he meant to do. Therefore disappointment, and some anxiety, met me when I stepped from the Hermana's gangway upon her deck, and Charley asked me if he was coming. But the launch, set back to wait, finally brought John, apologizing for his lateness. Meanwhile, I was pleased to find among the otherwise complete party General Rieppe. What I had seen of him from a distance held promise, and the hero's nearer self fulfilled it. We fell to each other's lot for the most natural of reasons. Nobody else desired the company of either of us. Charley was making himself the devoted servant of Hortense, while Kitty drew Beverly, Bohm, and Gazza in her sprightly wake. To her, indeed, I made a few compliments during the first few minutes after my coming aboard, while every sort of drink and cigar was being circulated among us by the cabin boy. Kitty's costume was the most markedly maritime thing that I have ever beheld in any waters, and her white shoes looked, I must confess, supremely well on her pretty little feet. I am no advocate of sumptuary laws, but there should be one prohibiting big-footed women from wearing white shoes. Did these women know what a spatulated effect their feet so shod produce? No lawn should be needed. Yes, Kitty was superlatively, stridently maritime. You could have known from a great distance that she belonged to the very latest steam yacht class, and that she was perfectly ignorant of the whole subject. On her left arm, for instance, was worked a red propeller with one blade down and 2 chevrons. It was the rating mark for a chief engineer, but this, had she known it, would not have disturbed her. "I chose it," she told me in reply to my admiration of it, "because it's so pretty. Oh, won't we enjoy ourselves while those stupid old blue bloods in Kings Port are going to church?" And with this she gave a skip, and ordered the cabin boy to bring her a Remsen cooler. Beverly Rodgers called for dwarf's blood, and I chose a horse's neck, and soon found myself in the society of the General. He was sipping whiskey and plain water. "I am a rough soldier, sir," he explained to me, "and I keep to the simple beverage of the camp. Had we not rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of?" And he waved a stately hand at my horse's neck. "You are acquainted with the works of Shakespeare?" I replied that I had a moderate knowledge of them, and assured him that a horse's neck was very simple. "Doubtless, sir, but a veteran is ever old-fashioned." "Papa," said Hortense, "don't let the sun shine upon your head." "Thank you, daughter mine." They said no more, but I presently felt that for some reason she watched him. He moved farther beneath the awning, and I followed him. "Are you a father, sir?" "No." "Then you cannot appreciate what it is to confide such a jewel as yon girl to another's keeping." He summoned the cabin boy, who brought him some more of the simple beverage of the camp, and I, feeling myself scarce at liberty to speak on matters so near to him and so far from me as his daughter's marriage, called his attention to the beautiful aspect of Kings Port, spread out before us in a long white line against the blue water. The General immediately seized this opportunity. "Sweet Auburn, loveliest village of the plain! You are acquainted with the works of Goldsmith, sir?" I professed some knowledge of this author also, and the General's talk flowed ornately onward. Though I had little to say to him about his daughter's marriage, he had much to say to me. Miss Josephine St. Michael would have been gratified to hear that her family was considered suitable for Hortense to contract an alliance with. "My girl is not stepping down, sir," the father assured me, and he commended the St. Michaels and the whole connection. He next alluded tragically, but vaguely, to misfortunes which had totally deprived him of income. I could not precisely fix what his inheritance had been. Sometimes he spoke of cotton, but next it would be rice, and he touched upon sugar more than once; but whatever it was, it had been vast and was gone. He told me that I could not imagine the feelings of a father who possessed a jewel and no dowry to give her. "A queen's estate should have been hers," he said. "But what? Who steals my purse steals trash." And he sat up, nobly braced by the philosophic thought. But he soon was shaking his head over his enfeebled health. Was I aware that he had been the cause of postponing the young people's joy twice? Twice had the doctors forbidden him to risk the emotions that would attend his giving his jewel away. He dwelt upon his shattered system to me, and indeed it required some dwelling on, for he was the picture of admirable preservation. "But I know what it is myself," he declared, "to be a lover and have bliss delayed. They shall be united now. A soldier must face all arrows, what?" I had hoped he might quote something here, but was disappointed. His conversation would soon cease to interest me, should I lose the excitement of watching for the next classic, and my eye wandered from the General to the water, where, happily, I saw John Mayrant coming in the launch. I briskly called the General's attention to him, and was delighted with the unexpected result. "Oh, young Lochinvar has come out of the West," said the General, lifting his glass. I touched it ceremoniously with mine. "The day will be hot," I said. The boy stood on the burning deck. On this I made my escape from him, and leaving him to his whiskey and his contemplating, I became aware that the eyes of the rest of the party were eager to watch the greeting between Hortense and John. But there was nothing to see. Hortense waited until her lover had made his apologies to Charley for being late, and from the way they met, she might have been no more to him than Kitty was. Whatever might be thought, whatever might be known by these onlookers, Hortense set the pace of how the open secret was to be taken. She made it, for all of us, as smooth and smiling as the waters of Kings Port were this fine day. How much did they each know? I asked myself how much they had shared in common. To these replacers, Kings Port had opened no doors. They and their automobile had skirted around the outside of all things. And if Charlie knew about the wedding, he also knew that it had been already twice postponed. He too could have said, as Miss Eliza had once said to me, "The cake is not baked yet." The General's talk to me, I felt as I took in how his health had been the centered point, was probably the result of previous arrangements with Hortense herself, and she quite as certainly inspired whatever she allowed him to say to Charlie. As for Kitty, she knew that her brother was set. She always came back to that. If Hortense found this Sunday morning a passage of particularly delicate steering, she showed it in no way, unless by that heightened radiance and triumph of beauty which I had seen in her before. No, the splendor of the day, the luxuries of the Hermana, the conviviality of the Replacers, all melted the occasion down to an ease and enjoyment in which even John Mayrant, with his grave face, was not perceptible, unless, like myself, one watched him. It was my full expectation that we should now get under way and proceed among the various historic sights of Kings Port Harbor, but of this I saw no signs anywhere on board the Hermana. Abeam of the foremast, her boat booms remained rigged out on port and starboard, her boats riding to painters, while her crew wore a look as generally lounging as those of her passengers. Beverly Rodgers told me the reason. We had no pilot. The negro watermen engaged for this excursion in the upper waters had failed of appearance, and when Charlie was for looking up another, Kitty, Bohm, and Gazza had dissuaded him. "Kitty," said Beverly, "told me she didn't care about the musty old forts and things, anyhow." I looked at Kitty and heard her tongue ticking away like the little clock she was. She had her Bohm, she had her nautical costume and her Remsen cooler. These, with the lunch that would come in time, were enough for her. "But it was such a good chance!" I exclaimed in disappointment. "Chance for what, old man?" "To see everything, the forts, the islands, and it's beautiful, you know, all the way to the Navy Yard." Beverly followed my glance to where the gay company was sitting among the cracked ice and bottles and cigar boxes, chattering volubly with its back to the scenery. He gave his laissez-faire chuckle and laid a hand on my shoulder. "Don't worry 'em with forts and islands, old boy. They know what they want. No living breed on earth knows better what it wants." "Well, they don't get it." "Huh, don't they?" "The cold fear of ennui gnaws at their vitals this minute." Shrill laughter from Kitty and Gazza served to refute my theory. "Of course, very few know what's the matter with them," I added. "You seldom spot an organic disease at the start." Said Beverly lengthily. "You put a pin through some of 'em. Hortense hasn't got the disease, though." "Ah, she spotted it. She's taking treatment. It's likely to help her for a time." He looked at me. "You know something." I nodded. He looked at Hortense, who was now seated among the noisy group with quiet John beside her. She was talking to Bohm. She had no air of any special relation to John, but there was a luster about her that spoke well for the treatment. "Then it's coming off?" said Beverly. "She has been too much for him," I answered. Beverly misunderstood. "He doesn't look it." "That's what I mean." "But the fool can cut loose. Oh, you and I've gone over all that. I've even gone over it with him." Beverly looked at Hortense again. "And her fire eater's fortune is about double what it would have been. I don't see how she's going to square herself with Charlie." "She'll wait till that's necessary. It isn't necessary today." We had to drop our subject here, for the owner of the Hermana approached us with the amiable purpose, I found, of making himself civil for a while to me. "I think you would have been interested to see the Navy Yard," I said to him. "I have seen it," Charlie replied in his slightly foreign, careful voice. "It is not a Navy Yard. It is small politics and a big swamp. I was not interested." "Dear me!" I cried. "But surely it's going to be very fine." "Another gold brick sold to Uncle Sam." Charlie's words seemed always to drop out like little accurately measured coins from some minting machine. They should not have changed from the old place if they wanted a harbor that could be used in wartime. Here they must always keep at least one dredge going out at the jetties. So the enemy blows up your dredge and you are bottled in or bottled out. It is very simple for the enemy, and for Kings Port, Navy Yards do not galvanize dead trade. It was a gold brick. You have not been on the Hermana before?" He knew that I had not, but he wished to show her to me, and I soon noted a difference, as radical as it was diverting, between this banker yachtsman's speech when he talked of affairs on land and when he attempted to deal with nautical matters. The clear, dispassionate finality of his tone when phosphates or railroads or navy yards or imperial loans were concerned left him, and changed to something very like a recitation of trigonometry, well memorized but not at all mastered. He could do that particular sum, but you mustn't stop him, and I concluded that I would rather have Charley for my captain during a panic in Wall Street than in a hurricane at sea. He, too, wore highly pronounced sea clothes of the ornamental kind, and though they fitted him physically, they hung baggily upon his unmarine spirit, giving him the air, as it were, of a broiled quail served on oyster shells. Beverly Rodgers, the consummate Beverly, was the only man of us whose clothes seemed to belong to him. He looked as if he could sail a boat. While the cabin boy continued to rush among the guests with siphons, ice, and fresh refreshments, Charley became the Hermana's guidebook for me, and our interview gave me, I may say, entertainment unalloyed, although there lay all the while beneath the entertainment my sadness and concern about John. Charley was the owner of the Hermana, there was no doubt of that. She had cost him, it was not long before he told me, $50,000, and to run her it cost him $1,000 a month. Yes, he was her owner, but there it stopped. No matter with how solemn a face he inspected each part of her, or spoke of her details, he was as much a passenger on her as myself. And this was as plain on the equally solemn faces of his crew, from the sailing master down through the 2 quartermasters to the 5 deckhands, as was the color of the Hermana's stack, which was, of course, yellow. She was a pole-mast, schooner-rigged steam yacht, Charley accurately told me, with clipper bow and spiked bowsprit. "About 100 tons?" I inquired. "Yes, 100 feet long, beam 20 feet, and she draws 12 feet," said Charley, and I thought I detected the mate listening to him. He now called my attention to the flags, and I am certain that I saw the sailing master hide his mouth with his hand. Some of the deckhands seemed to gather delicately nearer to us. "Sunday, of course," I said, and I pointed to the jack flying from a staff at the bow. But Charley did not wish me to tell him about the flags, he wished to tell me about the flags. "I am very strict about all this," he said, his gravity and nauticality increasing with every word. "At the foretruck flies our club burgee." I went through my part, giving a solemn, silent, intelligent assent. "That is my private signal at the main truck. It was designed by Miss Rieppe." As I again intelligently nodded, I saw the boatswain move an elbow into the ribs of one of the quartermasters. "On the staff at the taffrail I have the United States yacht ensign," Charley continued. "That's all," he said, looking about for more flags, and, to his disappointment, I think, finding no more. For he added, "But at 8 bells, the crew's meal flag will be in the port fore rigging. While we are at lunch, my meal flag will be in the starboard main rigging." "It should be there all day," I was tempted to remark to him, as my wandering eye fell on the cabin boy carrying something more on a plate to Kitty; but instead of this I said, "Well, she's a beautiful boat." Charley shook his head. "I'm going to get rid of her." I was surprised. "Isn't she all right?" It seemed to me that the crew behind us were very attentive now. "There is not enough refrigerator space," said Charley. One of the deckhands whirled round instantly, but stolidity sat like adamant upon the faces of the others as Charley turned in their direction, and we continued our tour of the Hermana. Thus the little banker let me see his little soul deep down, and there I saw that to pass for a real yachtsman, which he would never be able to do, was dearer to his pride than to bring off successfully some huge and delicate matter in the world's finance, which he could always do supremely well. I'm just like that, too, I thought to myself, and we returned to the gay Kitty. But Kitty, despite her gaiety, had serious thoughts upon her mind. Charley's attentions to me had met all that politeness required, and as we went aft again, his sister caused certain movements and rearrangements to happen with chairs and people. I didn't know this at once, but I knew it when I found myself somehow sitting with her and John, and saw Hortense with Charley. Hortense looked over at Kitty with a something that had in it both raised eyebrows and a shrug, though these visible signs did not occur. And indeed, so far as anything visible went, except the look, you might have supposed that now Hortense had no thoughts for any man in the world save Charley. And John was plainly more at ease with Kitty. He began to make himself agreeable, so that once or twice she gave him a glance of surprise. There was nothing to mark him out from the others except his paleness in the midst of their redness. Yachting clothes bring out wonderfully how much you are in the habit of eating and drinking, and an innocent stranger might have supposed that the replacers were richly sunburned from exposure to the blazing waters of Cuba and the tropics. Kitty deemed it suitable to extol Kings Port to John. Quaint was the word that did most of this work for her. She found everything that, even the negroes, and when she had come to the end of it, she supposed the inside must be just as quaint as the outside. "It is," said John Mayrant. He was enjoying Kitty. Then he became impertinent. "You ought to see it." "Do you stay inside much?" said Kitty. "We all do," said John. "Some of us never come out." "But you came out," Kitty suggested. "Oh, I've been out," John returned. He was getting older. I doubt if the past few years of his life had matured him as much as had the past few days. Then he looked at Kitty in the eyes. "And I'd always come out, if romance rang the bell." Said Kitty. "Then you know that ring." "We begin to hear it early in Kings Port," remarked John. "About the age of 14." Kitty looked at him with an interest that now plainly revealed curiosity also. It occurred to me that he could not have found any great embarrassment in getting on at Newport. "What if I rang the bell myself?" explained Kitty. "Come in the evening," returned John. "We won't go home till morning." Kitty kissed her hand to him, and during the pleased giggle that she gave, I saw her first taking in John and then Hortense. Kitty was thinking of John's crudity. And so I made a little experiment for myself. I wonder if men seem as similar in making love as women do in receiving it. "They aren't!" shouted both John and Kitty in the same indignant breath. Their noise brought Bohm to listen to us. This experiment was so much a success that I promptly made another for the special benefit of Bohm, Kitty's next husband. I find it often delightful to make a little gratuitous mischief just to watch the victims. I addressed Kitty. "What would you do if a man said he could drown in your hair as joyfully as the Duke of Clarence did in his butt of Malmsey?" Why," gasped Kitty. Why, I suppose it gave John time, but even so he was splendid. "She has heard it said!" This was his triumphant shout. I should not have supposed that Kitty could have turned any redder, but she did. John buried his nose in the tall glass and gulped a choking quantity of its contents, and mopped his face profusely. But little good that effected. There sat this altogether innocent pair, deeply suffused with the crimson of apparent guilt, and there stood Kitty's next husband, eyeing them suspiciously. My little gratuitous mischief was a perfect success, and remains with me as one of the bright spots in this day of pleasure. Vivacious measures from the piano brought Kitty to her feet. "There's Gazza!" she cried. "We'll make him sing!" And on the instant she was gone down the companionway. Bohm followed her with a less agitated speed, and soon all were gone below, leaving John and me alone on the deck, sitting together in silence. John lolled back in his chair, slowly sipping at his tall glass, and neither of us made any remark. I think he wanted to ask me how I came to mention the Duke of Clarence, but I did not see how he very well could, and he certainly made no attempt to do so. Thus did we sit for some time, hearing the piano and the company grow livelier and louder with solos and choruses and laughter. By and by the shadow of the awning shifted, causing me to look up, when I saw the shores slowly changing. The tide had turned and was beginning to run out. Land and water lay in immense peace, the long white silent picture of the town with its steeples on the one hand, and on the other the long low shore, and the trees behind. Into this rose the high voice of Gazza, singing in broken English, "Razzla dazzla, razzla dazzla," while his hearers beat upon glasses with spoons. At least, so I conjectured. "Aren't you coming, John?" asked Hortense, appearing at the companionway. She looked very bacchanalian. Her splendid amber hair was half riotous, and I was reminded of the toboggan fire escape. He obeyed her, and now I had the deck entirely to myself, or rather, but one other and distant person shared it with me. The hours had come, the bells had struck. Charley's crew was eating its dinner below forward. Charley's guests were drinking their liquor below aft. Charley's correct meal flag was to be seen in the port fore rigging, as he had said, red and triangular, and away off from me in the bow was the anchor watch, whom I dreamily watched trying to light his pipe. His matches seemed to be bad, and the brotherly thought of helping him drifted into my mind, and comfortably out of it again, without disturbing my agreeable repose. It had been really entertaining in John to tell Kitty that she ought to see the inside of Kings Port. That was like his engaging impishness with Juno. If by any possible contrivance, and none was possible, Kitty and her replacers could have met the inside of Kings Port, Kitty would have added one more quaint impression to her stock, and gone away in total ignorance of the quality of the impression she had made, and Bohm would probably have again remarked, "Worse than Sunday." No, the St. Michaels and the replacers would never meet in this world, and I see no reason that they should in the next. John's light and pleasing skirmish with Kitty gave me the glimpse of his capacities which I had lacked hitherto. John evidently knew his way about, as they say, and I was diverted to think how Miss Josephine St. Michael would have nodded over his adequacy and shaken her head at his squandering it on such a companion. But it was no squandering. The boy's heavy spirit was making a gallant bluff at playing up with the lively party he had no choice but to join, and this one saw the moment he was not called upon to play up. The peaceful loveliness that floated from earth and water around me triumphed over the jangling hilarity of the cabin, and I dozed away, aware that they were now all thumping furiously in chorus, while Gazza sang something that went, "Oh, she's my leetle pretty posy pet." When I roused, it was Kitty's voice at the piano, but no change in the quality of the song or the thumping, and Hortense was stepping on deck. She had a cigarette, her beauty flashed with devilment, and John followed her. They are going to have an explanation, I thought, as I saw his face. If that were so, then Kitty had blundered in her strategy and hurt Charley's cause, for after the two came Gazza, as obviously sent as any emissary ever looked. Kitty took care of the singing, while Gazza intercepted any tête-à-tête. I rose and made a fourth with them, and even as I was drawing near, the devilment in Hortense's face sank inward beneath cold displeasure. I had never been a welcome person to Hortense, and she made as little effort to conceal this as usual. Her indifferent eyes glanced at me with drowsy insolence, and she made her beautiful, low voice as remote and inattentive as her skillful social equipment could render it. "It is so hot in the cabin." This was all she had for me. Then she looked at Gazza with returning animation. "Oh la la," said Gazza, "if it is hot in the cabin," and he flirted his handkerchief back and forth. "I think I had the best of it," I remarked, "all the melody and none of the temperature." Hortense saw no need of noticing me further. "The singer has the worst of it," said Gazza. "But since you all sang," I laughed. "Miss Rieppe, she is cool," continued Gazza, "and she danced. It is not fair." John contributed nothing. He was by no means playing up now. He was looking away at the shore. Gazza hummed a little fragment. "But after lunch I will sing you good music." "So long as it keeps us cool," I suggested. "Ah, no, it will not be cool music," cried Gazza, "for those who understand." "Are those boys bathing?" Hortense now inquired. We watched the distant figures, and presently they flashed into the water. "Oh, me," sighed Gazza, "if I were a boy." Hortense looked at him. "You would be afraid." The devilment had come out again, suddenly and brilliantly. "I never have been afraid," declared Gazza. "You would not jump in after me," said Hortense, taking his measure more and more provokingly. Gazza laid his hand on his heart. "Where you go, I will go." Hortense looked at him and laughed very slightly and lightly. "I swear it! I swear!" protested Gazza. John's eyes were now fixed upon Hortense. "Would you go?" she asked him. "Decidedly not," he returned. I don't know whether he was angry or anxious. "Oh, yes, you would," said Hortense, and she jumped into the water, cigarette and all. "Get a boat, quick!" said John to me, and with his coat flung off, he was in the river, whose current Hortense could scarce have reckoned with, for they were both already astern as I ran out on the port boat boom. Gazza was dancing and shrieking, "Man overboard!" which indeed was the correct expression, only it did not apply to himself. Gazza was a very sensible person. I had, as I dropped into the nearest boat, a brisk sight of the sailing master springing like a jack-in-the-box on the deserted deck, with the roar of "Where's that haymaker?" His reference was to the anchor watch. The temptation to procure good matches to light his pipe had ended, I learned later, by proving too much for this responsible sailor man, and he had unfortunately chosen for going below just the unexpected moment when it had entered the daring head of Hortense to perform this extravagance. Of course, before I had pulled many strokes, the deck of the Hermana was alive with many manifestations of life saving, and they had most likely been in time. But I am not perfectly sure of this. The current was strong, and a surprising distance seemed to broaden between me and the Hermana before another boat came into sight around her stern. By then, or just after that, for I cannot clearly remember the details of these few anxious minutes, I had caught up with John, whose face and total silence, as he gripped the stern of the boat with one hand and held Hortense with the other, plainly betrayed it was high time somebody came. A man can swim, especially in salt water, with his shoes on, and his clothes add nothing of embarrassment if his arms are free, but a woman's clothes do not help either his buoyancy or the freedom of his movement. John now lifted Hortense's two hands, which took a good hold of the boat. From between her lips the disheveled cigarette, bitten through and limp, fell into the water. The boat felt the weight of the two hands to it. "Take care," I warned John. Hortense opened her eyes and looked at me. She knew that I meant her. "I'll not swamp you." This was her first remark. Her next was when, after no incautious haste, I had hauled her in over the stern, John working round to the bow for the sake of balance. "I was not dressed for swimming." Very quietly did Hortense speak, very coolly, very evenly. No fainting, and no flippancy. She was too game for either. After this, whatever emotion she had felt or was feeling, she showed none of them, unless it was by her complete silence. John's coming into the boat we managed with sufficient dexterity, aided by the horrified Charley, who now arrived personally in the other boat, and was for taking all three of us into that. But this was altogether unnecessary. He was made to understand that such transferences as it would occasion were superfluous, and so one of his men stepped into our boat to help me row back against the current, and for this I was not unthankful. Our return took, it appeared to me, a much longer time than everything else which had happened. When I looked over my shoulder at the Hermana, she seemed an incredible distance off, and when I looked again, she had grown so very little nearer that I abandoned this fruitless proceeding. Charley's boat had gone ahead to announce the good news to General Rieppe as soon as possible. But if our return was long to me, to Hortense it was not so. She sat beside her lover in the stern, and I knew that he was more to her than ever. It was her spirit also that wanted him now. Poor Kitty's words of prophecy had come perversely true. "Something will happen, and that boy'll be conspicuous." Well, it had happened with a vengeance, and all wrong for Kitty, and all wrong for me. Then I remembered Charley last of all. My doubt as to what he would have done had he been on deck was settled later by learning from his own lips that he did not know how to swim. Yes, the sentimental world, and by that I mean the immense and mournful preponderance of fools, and not the few of true sentiment, would soon be exclaiming, "How romantic! She found her heart. She had a glimpse of death's angel, and in that light saw her life's true happiness." But I should say nothing like that, nor would Miss Josephine St. Michael, if I read that lady at all right. She didn't know what I did about Hortense. She hadn't overheard sophistication confessing amorous curiosity about innocence. But the old Kings Port lady's sound instinct would tell her that a souse in the water wasn't likely to be enough to wash away the seasoning of a lifetime. And she would wait, as I should, for the day when Hortense, having had her taste of John's innocence, and having grown used to the souse in the water, would wax restless for the replacers, for excitement, for complexity, for the prismatic life. Then it might interest her to corrupt John, but if she couldn't, where would her occupation be, and how were they going to pull through? But now there sat Hortense in the stern, melted into whatever best she was capable of. It had come into her face. Her face was to be read, for the first time since I had known it, and, strangely enough, I couldn't read John's at all. It seemed happy, which was impossible. "Way enough!" he cried suddenly, and at his command the sailor and I took in our oars. Here was Hermana's gangway, and crowding faces above, and ejaculations and tears from Kitty. Yes, Hortense would have liked that return voyage to last longer. I was first on the gangway and stood to wait and give them a hand out, but she lingered, and rising slowly, spoke her first word to him softly. "And so I owe you my life." "And so I restore it to you complete," said John instantly. None could have heard it but myself, unless the sailor beyond whose comprehension it was, and I doubted for a moment if I could have heard right. But it was for a moment only. Hortense stood stiff, and then, turning, came in front of him, and I read her face for an instant longer before the furious hate in it was mastered to meet her father's embrace, as I helped her up the gang. "Daughter mine," said the General, with a magnificent break in his voice. But Hortense was game to the end. She took Kitty's hysterics and the men's various grades of congratulation. Her word to Gazza would have been supreme but for his imperishable rejoinder. "I told you you wouldn't jump," was what she said. Gazza stretched both arms, pointing to John. "But a native, he was surer to find you." At this they all remembered John, whom they thus far hadn't thought of. "Where is that lion-hearted boy?" the General called out. John hadn't got out of the boat. He thought he ought to change his clothes, he said, and when Charley, truly astonished, proffered his entire wardrobe and reminded him of lunch, it was thank you very much, but if he could be put ashore. I looked for Hortense to see what she would do, but Hortense had gone below with Kitty to change her clothes, and the genuinely hearty protestations from all the rest brought merely pleasantly firm politeness from John, as he put on again the coat he had flung off on jumping. At least he would take a drink, urged Charley. Yes, thank you, he would, and he chose brandy and soda, of which he poured himself a remarkably stiff one. Charley and I poured ourselves milder ones for the sake of company. "Here's how," said Charley to John. "Yes, here's how," I added more emphatically. John looked at Charley with a somewhat extraordinary smile. "Here's unquestionably how," he exclaimed. We had a gay lunch. I should have supposed there was plenty of room in the Hermana's refrigerator, nor did the absence of Hortense and John, the cause of our jubilation, at all interfere with the jubilation itself. By the time the launch was ready to put me ashore, Gazza had sung several miles of good music and double that quantity of Razzla Dazzla, and General Rieppe was crying copiously and assuring everybody that God was very good to him. But Kitty had told us all that she intended Hortense to remain quiet in her cabin, and she kept her word. Quite suddenly, as the launch was speeding me toward Kings Port, I exclaimed aloud, "The cake!" And, I thought, the cake was now settled forever. End of chapter 21. Recording by Lois Hill, Kamei, Idaho. Chapter 22 of Lady Baltimore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lois Hill. Lady Baltimore by Owen WISTER. Chapter 22. Behind the Times. It was my lot to attend but one of the weddings which Hortense precipitated, or at least determined, by her plunge into the water, and truth to say, the honor of my presence at the other was not requested. Therefore I am unable to describe the nuptials of Hortense and Charley. But the papers were full of them, what the female guests wore, what the male guests were worth, and what both ate and drank, were set forth in many columns of printed matter. And if you did not happen to see this, just read the account of the next wedding that occurs among the New York yellow rich, and you will know how Charley and Hortense were married, for it's always the same thing. The point of mark in this particular ceremony of union lay in Charley's speech. Charley found a happy thought at the breakfast. The bridal party, so the papers had it, sat on a dais, and was composed exclusively of oil, sugar, beef, steel, and Union Pacific. Merely at this one table $500 million were sitting, so the papers computed, and it helped the bridegroom to his idea when, by the importunate vociferations of the company, he was forced to get on his unwilling legs. "Poets and people of that sort say," Charlie concluded, after thanking them, "that happiness cannot be bought with money. Well, I guess a poet never does learn how to make a dollar do a dollar's work. But I am no poet, and I have learned it is as well to have a few dollars around. And I guess that my friends and I, right here at this table, could organize a corner in happiness any day we chose. And if we do, we will let you all in on it." I am told that the bride looked superb, both in church and at the reception which took place in the house of Kitty, and that General Rieppe, in spite of his shattered health, maintained a noble appearance through the whole ordeal of parting with his daughter. I noticed that Beverly Rodgers and Gazza figured prominently among the invited guests. Bohm did not have to be invited, for some time before the wedding he had become the husband of the successfully divorced Kitty. So much for the nuptials of Hortense and Charlie. They were, as one paper pronounced them, up to date and distingué. The paper omitted the accent in the French word, which makes it, I think, fit this wedding even more happily. "So Hortense," I said to myself as I read the paper, "has squared herself with Charlie after all." And I sat wondering if she would be happy. But she was not constructed for happiness. You cannot be constructed for all the different sorts of experiences which this world offers. Each of our natures has its specialty. Hortense was constructed for pleasure, and I have no doubt she got it, if not through Charlie, then by other means. The marriage of Eliza La Heu and John Mayrant was of a different quality. No paper pronounced it up to date, or bestowed any other adjectival comments upon it, for, being solemnized in Kings Port, where such purely personal happenings are still held, by the St. Michael family at any rate, to be no business of any one's save those immediately concerned, the event escaped the famishment of publicity. Yes, this marriage was solemnized, a word that I used above without forethought, and now repeat with intention, for certainly no respecter of language would write it of the yellow rich and their blatant unions. If you're a Bohm or a Charlie, you may trivialize or vulgarize or bestialize your wedding, but solemnize it you don't, for that is not up to date. And to the marriage of Eliza and John I went, for not only was the honor of my presence requested, but John wrote me, in both their names, a personal note, which came to me far away in the mountains whither I had gone from Kings Port. This was the body of the note: "To the formal invitation which you will receive, Miss La Heu joins her wish with mine that you will not be absent on that day. We should both really miss you. Miss La Heu begs me to add that if this is not sufficient inducement, you shall have a slice of Lady Baltimore." Not a long note, but you will imagine how genuinely I was touched by their joint message. I was not an old acquaintance, and I had done little to help them in their troubles, but I came into the troubles. With their memory of those days I formed a part, and it was a part which it warmed me to know they did not dislike to recall. I had actually been present at their first meeting, that day when John visited the Exchange to order his wedding cake, and Eliza had rushed after him, because in his embarrassment he had forgotten to tell her the date for which he wanted it. The cake had begun it. The cake had continued it. The cake had brought them together. And in Eliza's retrospect now, I doubted if she could find the moment when her love for John had awakened. But if with women there ever is such a moment, then, as I have before said, it was when the girl behind the counter looked across at the handsome, blushing boy and felt stirred to help him in his stumbling attempts to be businesslike about that cake. If his youth unwittingly kindled hers, how could he or she help that? But had he ever once known it and shown it to her during his period of bondage to Hortense, then indeed the flame would have turned to ice in Eliza's breast. What saved him for her was his blind steadfastness against her. That was the very thing she prized most, once it became hers, whereas any secret swerving toward her from Hortense during his heavy hours of probation would have degraded John to nothing in Eliza's eyes. And so, making all this out by myself in the mountains, after reading John's note, I ordered from the North the handsomest old china cake dish that Aunt Carola could find, to be sent to Miss Eliza La Heu with my card. I wanted to write on the card, Rira bien que vive le dernier. But alas, so many pleasant thoughts may never be said aloud in this world of ours. That I ordered china instead of silver was due to my surmise that in Kings Port, or at any rate by Mrs. Weguelin and Miss Josephine St. Michael, silver from anyone not of the family would be considered vulgar. It was only a surmise, and of course it was precisely the sort of thing that I could not verify by asking any of them. But you may be asking, how on earth did all this come about? What happened in Kings Port on the day following that important swim which Hortense and John took together in the waters of the harbor? I wish that I could tell you all that happened, but I can only tell you of the outside of things. The inside was wholly invisible and inaudible to me, although we may be sure, I think, that when the circles that widened from Hortense's plunge reached the shores of the town, there must have been in certain quarters a considerable splashing. I presume that John communicated to somebody the news of his broken engagement, for if he omitted to do so with the wedding invitations to be out the next day, he was remiss beyond excuse, and I think this very unlikely. And I also presume, with some evidence to go on, that Hortense did not, in the somewhat critical juncture of her fortunes, allow the grass to grow under her feet, if such an expression may be used of a person who is shut up in the stateroom of a steam yacht. To me, John Mayrant made no sign of any sort by word or in writing, and this is the highest proof he ever gave me of his own delicacy, and also of his reliance upon mine, for he must have been pretty sure that I had overheard those last destiny-deciding words spoken between himself and Hortense in the boat as we reached the Hermana's gangway. In John's place, almost any man, even Beverly Rodgers, would have either dropped a hint at the moment, or later sent me some line to the effect that the incident was, of course, between ourselves. That would have been both permissible and practical. But there it was, the difference between John of Kings Port and us others. He was not practical when it came to something between gentlemen, as he would have said. The finest flower of breeding blossoms above the level of the practical, and that is why you do not find it growing in the huge truck garden of our age, save in corners where it has not yet been uprooted. John's silence to me was something that I liked very much, and he must have found that it was not misplaced. The first external splash of the few that I have to narrate was a negative manifestation, and occurred at breakfast. Juno supposed if the wedding invitations would be out later in the day. The next splash was somewhat louder on, was at dinner, when Juno inquired of Mrs. Trevise if she had received any wedding invitation. At tea time was very decided splashing. No invitation had come to anybody. Juno had called at 5 of the St. Michael houses and got in at none of them, and there was a rumor that the Hermana had disappeared from the harbor. So far, none of the splashing had wet me, but I now came in for a light sprinkle. "Were you not on board that boat yesterday?" Juno inquired, and to see her look at me, you might have gathered that I was suspected of sinking the vessel. "A most delightful occasion!" I exclaimed, filling my face with a bright blankness. "Isn't he awful to speak that way about Sunday?" said the up-country bride. This was a chance for the poetess, and she took it. "To me," she mused, "every day seems fraught with an equal holiness." "But I should think," observed the Briton, "that you could knock off a hymn better on Sundays." All this while Juno was looking at me, and I knew it, and therefore I ate my food in a kindly sort of unconscious way until she fired another shot at me. "There's an absurd report that somebody fell overboard." "Dear me!" I laughed. "So that is what it has grown to already. I did go out on the boat boom, and I did drop off, but into a boat." At this confession of mine, the up-country bride became extraordinarily arch on the subject of the well-known hospitality of steam yachts, and for this I was honestly grateful to her. But Juno brooded still. "I hope there is nothing wrong," she said solemnly. Feeling that silence at this point would not be golden, I went into it with spirit when I told them of our charming party, of General Rieppe's rich store of quotations, of the strict discipline on board the well-appointed Hermana, of the great beauty of Hortense, and her evident happiness when her lover was by her side. This talk of mine turned off any curiosity or suspicion which the rest of the company may have begun to entertain, but upon Juno I think it made scant impression, save causing her to set me down as an imbecile. For there was Dr. Beaugarcon when we came into the sitting room, who told us before anyone could even say how do you do, that Miss Hortense Rieppe had broken her engagement with John Mayrant, and that he had it from Mrs. Cornerly, whom he was visiting professionally. I caught the pitying look which Juno threw me at this news, and I was happy to have acquitted myself so creditably in the manipulation of my secret. Nobody asked me any more questions. There is almost nothing else to tell you of how the splashes broke on Kings Port. Before the day when I was obliged to call in Dr. Beaugarcon's professional services, quite a sharp attack put me to bed for half a week, I found merely the following things: the Hermana gone to New York, the automobiles and the replacers had also disappeared, and people were divided on the not strikingly important question as to whether Hortense and the General had accompanied Charley on the yacht, or continued northward in an automobile, or taken the train. Gone, in any case, the whole party indubitably was, leaving, I must say, a sense of emptiness. The comedy was over, the players departed. I never heard anyone, not even Juno, doubt that it was Hortense who had broken the engagement. This part of the affair was conducted by the principals with great skill. Hortense had evidently written her version to the Cornerlys, and not a word to any other effect ever came from John's mouth, of course. One result I had not looked for, though it was a natural one. If the old ladies had felt indignation at Hortense for her determination to marry John Mayrant, this indignation was doubled by her determination not to. I fear that few of us live by logic, even in Kings Port, and then they had all called upon her in that garden for nothing. The sudden thought of this made me laugh alone in my bed of sickness, and when I came out of it, had such a thing been possible, I should have liked to congratulate Miss Josephine St. Michael on her absence from the garden occasion. I said, however, nothing to her or to any of the other ladies upon this or any subject, for I was so unlucky as to find them not at home when I paid my round of farewell visits. Nor, to my real distress, did I see John Mayrant again. The boy wrote me, I received it in bed, a short, warm note of regret, with nothing else in it save the fact that he was leaving town, having become free from the custom house at last. I fancy that he ran away for a judicious interval. Who would not? Was there one person to whom he told the truth before he went? Did the girl behind the counter hear the manner in which the engagement was broken? Oh, none of us will ever know that. But although I could not, without the highest impropriety, have spoken to any of the old ladies about this business, unless they had chosen to speak to me, and somehow I feel that after the abrupt close of it not even Mrs. Gregory St. Michael would have been likely to touch on the subject with an outsider, there was nothing whatever to forbid my indulging in a skirmish with Eliza La Heu. Therefore, I lunched at the Exchange on my last day. "To the mountains," she said in reply to my information about my plans of travel. "Dr. Beaugarcon says nothing else can so quickly restore me." "Stay there for the rhododendrons, then," she bade me. "No sight more beautiful in all the South." "Town seems deserted," I pursued. "Everybody gone." "Oh, not everybody." "All the interesting people." "Thank you." "I meant interesting to you." I saw her decide not to be angry, and her decision changed and saved our conversation from the trashy, bantering tone which it was taking, and brought it to a pass most unexpected to both of us. She gave me a charming and friendly smile. "Well, you, at any rate, are going away, and I am really sorry for that." Her eyes rested upon me with perfect frankness. I was not in love with Eliza La Heu, but nearer to love than I had ever been then, and it would have been easy, very easy, to let oneself go straight onward into love. There are, for a man, more ways of falling into that state than romancers would have us to believe, and one of them is by an assent of the will at a certain given moment, which the heart promptly follows, just as a man in a moment decides he will espouse a cause, and soon finds himself hotly fighting for it, body and soul. I could have gone out of that Exchange completely in love with Eliza La Heu, but my will did not give its assent, and I saw John Mayrant not as a rival, but as one whose happiness I greatly desired. "Thank you," I said, "for telling me you are sorry I am going. And now may I treat you more than ever as a friend, and tell you of a circumstance which Kings Port does not know?" It put her on her guard. "Don't be indiscreet," she laughed. "Isn't timely indiscretion discretion?" "And don't be clever," she said. "Tell me what you have to say. If you're quite sure you'll not be sorry." "Quite sure. There's no reason, now that the untruth is properly and satisfactorily established, that one person should not know that John Mayrant broke that engagement." And I told her the whole of it. "If I'm outrageous to share this secret with you," I concluded, "I can only say that I couldn't stand the unfairness any longer." "He jumped straight in?" said Eliza. "Oh, straight." "Of course," she murmured. "And just after declaring that he wouldn't." "Of course," she murmured again. "And the current took them right away?" "Instantly." "Was he very tired when you got to him?" I answered this question and a number of others, backward and forward, until she had led me to cover the whole incident about 2.5 times. Then she had a silence, and after this a reflection. "How well they managed it!" "Managed what?" "The accepted version." "Oh, yes, indeed." "And you and I will not spoil it for them," she declared. As I took my final leave of her, she put a flower in my buttonhole. My reflection was then, and is now, that if she already knew the truth from John himself, how well she managed it. So that same night I took the lugubrious train which bore me with the grossest deliberation to the mountains, and among the mountains and their waterfalls I stayed, and saw the rhododendrons, and was preparing to journey home, when the invitation came from John and Eliza. I have already said that of this wedding no word was in the papers. Kings Port by the war lost all material things, but not the others, among which precious privacy remains to her. And oh, Kings Port, may you never lose your grasp of that treasure! May you never know the land where the reporter blooms, where, if any joy or grief befall you, the public press rings your doorbell and demands the particulars, and if you deny it the particulars, it makes them up and says something scurrilous about you into the bargain. Therefore nothing was printed, morning or evening, about John and Eliza. Nor was the wedding service held in church to the accompaniment of nodding bonnets and gaping stragglers. No eye not tender with regard and emotion looked on while John took Eliza to his wedded wife, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy state of matrimony. In Royal Street, not many steps from South Place, there stands a quiet house a little back, upon whose face sorrow has struck many blows, but made no deep wounds yet. No scorch from the fires of war is visible, and the rending of the earthquake does not show too plainly. But there hangs about the house a gravity that comes from seeing and suffering much, and a sweetness from having sheltered many generations of smiles and tears. The long linked chain of births and deaths here has not been broken and scattered, and the grandchildren look out of the same windows from which the grandsires gazed, whose faces now in picture frames still watch serenely the sad present from their happy past. Therefore the rooms lie in still depths of association, and from the walls, the stairs, the furniture, flows the benign influence of undispersed memories. It sheds its tempered radiance upon the old miniatures, and upon every fresh flower that comes in from the garden. It seems to pass through the open doors to and fro like a tranquil blessing. It is beyond joy and pain, because time has distilled it from both of these. It is the assembled essence of kinship and blood unity, enriched by each succeeding brood that is born, is married, is fruitful in its turn, and dies remembered. Only the balm of faith is stronger to sustain and heal, for that comes from heaven, while it is earth that gives us this, and the sacred cup of it which our native land once held is almost empty. Amid this influence John and Eliza were made one, and the faces of the older generations grew soft beneath it, and pensive eyes became lustrous, and into pale cheeks the rosy tint came like an echo faintly back for a short hour. They made so little sound in their quiet happiness of congratulation that it might have been a dream, and they were so few that the house with the sense of its memories was not lost with the movement and crowding, but seemed still to preside over the whole and send down its benediction. When it was my turn to shake the hands of bride and groom, John asked, "What did your friend do with your advice?" And I replied, "He has taken it." "Perhaps not that," John returned, "but you must have helped him to see his way." When the bride came to cut the cake, she called me to her and fulfilled her promise. "You have always liked my baking," she said. "Then you made it after all," I answered. "I would not have been married without doing so," she declared sweetly. When the time came for them to go away, they were surrounded with affectionate Godspeeds, but Miss Josephine St. Michael waited to be the last, standing a little apart, her severe and chiseled face turned aside, and seeming to watch a mockingbird that was perched in his cage at a window halfway up the stairs. "He is usually not so silent," Miss Josephine said to me. "I suppose we are too many visitors for him." Then I saw that the old lady, beneath her severity, was deeply moved, and almost at once John and Eliza came down the stairs. Miss Josephine took each of them to her heart, but she did not trust herself to speak, and a single tear rolled down her face as the boy and girl continued to the hall door. There Daddy Ben stood, and John's gay good bye to him was the last word that I heard the bridegroom say, while we all stood silently watching them as they drove away from the tall iron gate. The mockingbird on the staircase broke into melodious ripples of song. End of chapter 22. Recording by Lois Hill, Kamei, Idaho. Chapter 23 of Lady Baltimore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lois Hill. Lady Baltimore by Owen WISTER. Chapter 23. Poor Aunt Carola. And now here goes my language back into the small clothes that it wore at the beginning of all, when I told you something of that colonial society, the Selected Salic Scions, dear to the heart of my aunt. It were beyond my compass to approach this august body of men and women with the respect that is its due, did I attire myself in that modern garment which, in the phrase of the vulgar, is denoted pants. You will scarce have forgot, I must suppose, the importance set by my Aunt Carola upon the establishing of the Scions in new territories, wherever such persons as were both qualified by their descent and in themselves worthy should be found. And you will remember that I was bidden by her to look in South Carolina for members of the Bombo connection, which she was inclined to suspect existed in that state. My neglect to make this inquiry for my kind aunt now smote me sharply, when all seemed too late. John Mayrant had spoken of Kill Devil Bombo, the very personage through whom lay Aunt Carola's claim to kingly lineage, and I had let John Mayrant go away upon his honeymoon without ever questioning him upon this subject. As I looked back upon the ease with which I might have settled the matter, and forward to my return empty-handed to the generous relative to whom I owed this agreeable experience of travel, I felt guilty indeed. I wrote a letter to follow John Mayrant into whatever retreat of bliss he had betaken himself to, and I begged him earnestly to write me at his early convenience all that he might know of Bombos in South Carolina. Consequently, I was able, on reaching home, to meet Aunt Carola with some sort of countenance, and to assure her that I expected presently to be furnished with authentic and valuable particulars. I now learned that the Selected Salic Scions had greatly increased in numbers during my short absence. It appeared that the origin of the whole movement had sprung from a needy but ingenious youth in some manufacturing town of New England. This lad had a cousin who had amassed from nothing a noble fortune by inventing one day a speedy and convenient fashion of opening beer bottles. And this cousin's achievement had set him to looking about him. He soon discovered that in our great republic, everywhere, there were living hundreds and thousands of men and women who were utterly unaware that they were descended from kings. Borrowing a little money to float him, he set up the American Almanach de Gotha and began, for the minimum sum of $50 a pedigree, to reveal to these eager people the chain of links that connected them with royalty. Thus, in a period of time the brevity of which is incredible, this young man passed from complete indigence to a wife and 4 automobiles, or an automobile and 4 wives, I don't remember which he had the 4 of. There was so much royal blood about that it had spilled into several rival organizations, each bitterly warring with the other, but my aunt assured me that her society was the only one that any respectable person belonged to. I am minded to announce a rule of discreet conduct. Never read aloud any letter that you have not first read to yourself. Had I observed this rule, but listen. It so happened that Aunt Carola was at luncheon with us when the postman brought John Mayrant's answer to my inquiry, and at the sight of his handwriting I thoughtlessly exclaimed to my aunt that here at last we had all there was to be known concerning the Bombos in South Carolina. With this I tore open the missive and embarked upon a reading of it for the edification of all present. I pass over the beginning of John's communication, because it was merely the observations of a man upon his honeymoon, and was confined to laudatory accounts of scenery and weather, and the beauty of all life when once one saw it with his eyes truly opened. No Bombos ever came to Carolina, he now continued, that I know of, or that Aunt Josephine knows of, which is more to the point. Aunt Josephine has copied me a passage from the writings of William Byrd, Esquire, of Westover, Virginia, in which mention is made, not of the family, but of a rum punch, which seems to have been concocted first by Admiral Bombo from a New England brand of rum so very deadly that it was not inaptly styled Kill Devil by the early planters of the colony. That the punch drifted to Carolina and still survives there, you have reason to know. Therefore, if any remote ancestors of yours contracted an alliance with Kill Devil Bombo, I can imagine no resulting offspring of such union but a series of severe attacks of What? Interrupted Aunt Carola at this point in her most formidable voice. What's that stuff you're reading, Augustus? I shook in my shoes. Why, Aunt, it's John. Not another word, sir, and never let me hear his name again. To think! To think! But here Aunt Carola's face grew extremely red, and she choked so decidedly that Uncle Andrew poured her a glass of water. The rest of our luncheon was conducted with remarkable solemnity. As we were rising from table, my aunt said, "It was high time, Augustus, that you came home. You seem to have got into very strange company down there." This was the last reference to the Bombos that my aunt ever made in my hearing. Of course, it is preposterous to suppose that she traces her descent from a king through a mere bowl of punch, and her being still the president of the selected Salic scions is proof irrefutable that her claim rests upon a more solid foundation. End of chapter 23. Recording by Lois Hill, Kamei, Idaho. Chapter 24 of Lady Baltimore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lois Hill. Lady Baltimore by Owen WISTER. Chapter 24. Postscriptum. I think that John Mayrant, Jr. is going to look like his mother. I was very glad to be present when he was christened, and at this ceremony I did not feel as I had felt the year before at the wedding. For then I had known well enough that if the old ladies found any blemish on that occasion, it was my being there. To them I must remain forever a Yankee, a wall perfectly imaginary and perfectly real between us. And the fact that young John could take any other view of me was to them a sign of that radical tendency in him which they were able to forgive solely because he was of the younger generation and didn't know any better. And with these thoughts in my mind, and remembering a certain very grave talk I had once held with Eliza in the Exchange about the North and the South, in which it was my good fortune to make her see that there is on our soil nowadays such a being as an American, who feels, wherever he goes in our native land, that it is all his, and that he belongs everywhere to it, I looked at the little John Mayrant, and then I said to his mother, "And will you teach him Dixie and Yankee Doodle as well?" But Eliza smiled at me with friendly, inscrutable eyes. "Oh," said John, "you mustn't ask too much of the ladies. I'll see to all that." Perhaps he will. And an education at Harvard College need not cause the boy to forget his race, or his name, or his traditions, but only to value them more, as they should be valued. And the way that they should be valued is this: that the boy, in thinking of them, should say to himself, "I am proud of my ancestors. Let my life make them proud of me." But in any case, is it not pleasant to think of the boy being brought up by Eliza, and not by Hortense? And so my portrait of Kings Port is finished. That the likeness is not perfect, I am only too sensible. No painter that I have heard of ever satisfies the whole family. But should any of the St. Michaels see this picture, I trust they may observe that if some of the touches are faulty, true admiration and love of his subject animated the artist's hand. And if Miss Josephine St. Michael should be pleased with any of it, I could wish that she might indicate this by sending me a Lady Baltimore. We have no cake here that approaches it. End of chapter 24. Recording by Lois Hill, Cami, Idaho. End of Lady Baltimore by Owen Wister.